Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the third meeting of the committee's investigation into grooming gangs in London. Today we are here to continue exploring this extremely important issue of grooming gangs in London, and we'll hear from the Metropolitan Police Service and representatives from the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. As this is a highly sensitive issue, I'd like to remind both Assembly members and guests to please avoid sharing any personal or contextual information that could identify victim survivors of grooming gangs. Please also take care not to disclose anything that could affect any current or future court case, such as identifying alleged offenders or referencing cases that are sub judice. I recognise that this discussion may be difficult for some, and I encourage anyone who needs support to reach out to available resources. Charities and organisations such as London Survivors, Gateway, Victim Support and the NSPCC helpline are available to offer support. Now, we've just got a few items of business to attend to. Can I now ask our clerk, Sal Faisal, if any apologies have been received?
Thank you, Chairman. Apologies for absence have been received from Assembly Member Desai.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the recommendations set out at item 2 and ask if members have any other interest to declare? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to confirm the minutes of the meeting held on the 17th of June 2026 to be signed by me as a correct record? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the ongoing actions arising from its previous meetings? Thank you. We now move on to our main item of business, and I would like to welcome our guests joining us in the chamber today. We have Kevin Southworth, KPM, Deputy Assistant Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police Service, Kaya Koma-Schwartz, Deputy Mayor for Policing and Crime, and Will Balakrishnan, Director of Commissioning and Partnerships from the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. Good morning, all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm going to start the questions, and the first one is to Kevin Southworth. Are you happy for us to refer to you as Kevin or Mr. Southworth?
Please call me Kevin, yes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. What assessment has the Met made about the nature of grooming gangs in London, both historically and today?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to come and address the panel today on this vital topic. I think, if I may, I'll just start by saying what I think we all feel and believe in all this, which is that our victim survivors are, of course, at the heart of all of this, and it's be remiss for me to start talking without mentioning their plight in all this. Victim survivors of child sex abuse and exploitation are, of course, a paramount concern for us in the Metropolitan Police, as they are for all of you and in policing across the country, and everything that we do is geared around them and their welfare. We're very aware of the abhorrent nature of this crime type and the public concern around it, so this has been something that's really focused our minds in recent years. The journey in this space for the Met, though, has been a complex one. So you may recall that just a couple of years ago, Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary came in and inspected our approach to child sexual exploitation and found examples of victim-blaming language and an inability to identify particularly missing children who might be at risk of exploitation, and indeed an ability to investigate child sexual exploitation that was below where we would want it to be at that time. And accelerated causes for concern were issued, of course, at that time as well. This also came simultaneously with the Sateria inspection findings. That's the transformational review into rape and sexual violence investigation, which also found serious shortfalls in our approach. I'm pleased to report here to this committee, and you'll have heard this in other forums as well, that since that time in 2022, there's been a very significant journey of improvement on behalf of our victim survivors to try to make sure that in every instance we safeguard children affected from such horrible crimes and at the same time bring offenders to justice. That transformation is a really important one, and I wanted to emphasise it here this morning, because within that we've seen a real overhaul, not just of our performance in terms of sexual violence, our ability to bring those who would rape and sexually abuse children and older people to justice, but also a significant cultural shift in how we identify those who may be at risk, who may previously have not gotten the service that they deserved. Without going on too much on this particular point, it's worth noting, though, that the rape charges in that time, which include many different forms of sexual violence, have gone up over threefold, in fact some would argue fourfold or more than where they were, resulting in many thousands more suspects being brought before the courts for rape and sexual abuse in all its forms, including child rape. There's also been, as I say, an overhaul of our approach to how we identify risk in children who are missing, and making sure that we identify the signs and symptoms of exploitation with extensive training across all of our frontline officers and staff in the Met on a scale I've never seen before in my 29 years of service, to make sure that we avoid the risks of adultification, of failing to see the child first in any situation, of failing to appreciate that a missing child missing from care may indeed be at greater harm outside the home due to extrafamilial harm than we could ever hope them to be. All of this has led to greater risk identification in missing children and greater numbers of child sexual and criminal exploitation being brought to the fore in a way that gives us the best chance to safeguard those children and to make sure that those who are responsible for their abuse are brought before the courts. In short, Chair and panel, there's never been a better time for any child, or indeed any grown-up who has been victim of child sex abuse in their younger years, to come forward and report their crime to us. We are charging now more suspects than we've ever charged before in this space. And I just wanted to take this opportunity, if I may, to obviously register an appeal in some ways to anyone who might be listening. If you or anyone you know is or has been subject to any form of child sex abuse and exploitation, please do come forward and report to us, because we are doing better than we've ever done before in this space, and we want to make sure that we safeguard everyone involved. However, there is a prelude to this, of course, which is that prior to that time, the very reason that Her Majesty's Inspectorate and others criticised our approach is because we know that going back some years now, not every victim would have had the response that we would hope they would have had. And that's why Operation Beacon Port, now led by the National Crime Agency, is going to be such an important operation for us nationally, not just for the Met, but for all forces. Operation Beacon Port, as you've seen from the call for evidence that we sent in, is a nationwide exercise to look back 15 years to try to understand better where we may have missed opportunities to safeguard children and to bring offenders to justice who may be involved in what we term group-based child sexual exploitation. We tend to stay away from the term grooming gang per se, because ultimately that means many different things to many different people. And within that, there's a hazard of misinterpretation or indeed creating greater public concern than is necessary. But I can say that on that journey, in terms of the assessment, and cleaving to your question, Chair, if I may, a quota of over 120,000 original offences over that 15 years have been looked at. And as you'll know from previous conversations with our Commissioner at this committee, that was brought down to about 9,000 originally that would fit the criteria that had been issued by the Operation Beacon Port leads at the National Crime Agency. Upon review, this went up slightly to about 12,000 offences, which may be in the scope of what is required. But it's important to note that that scope is a broad one. So, as you may or may not know, this is basically any crime which involves one or more suspect, some form of sexual contact offending, where there's been no further action brought by the police or Crown Prosecution Service. That very wide catchment of offence types incorporates, of course, intrafamilial harm, so we deal with by our child abuse investigation teams, so abuse within the home committed by family members. In this setting, of course, it would require more than one family member to be involved, but sadly that's more prevalent than we might care to appreciate. It would include peer-on-peer abuse, where children are abused by their peers in sexual context, which again is a significant quota and amounts to over 20% of the total of those offences that I've just articulated. It incorporates institutional abuse, where in perhaps a care home setting or similar, we've seen abuse on a systematic basis. And it also includes any type of child sexual exploitation where there's an asymmetry of power between those who are committing the offence and those who are subject to it. And that includes a very broad catchment of offences again, which straddles several hundred different crime classifications. The only way to quantify those is, of course, to apply a flagging system. And as with any flagging system, when you're trying to quantify so many different crime types and so many different modus operandi, that means that the figures that we issue in this space are subject to constant variance depending on how a question is asked and how it's answered. And of course they're fluid because they will change by the day as different investigations and allegations are substantiated, proven or disproven. So this very fluid space is being addressed now better than ever. The approach we have in place at the moment is a very strong and robust one, which is why I encourage victims to come forward, or indeed anyone else who has information. But retrospectively, we know that Operation Beacon Port will find cases undoubtedly where we've failed to protect children and young people in the past, who may indeed be grown-ups now, and failed to bring their offenders to justice. And that's why Operation Beacon Port has our full support, and why we're committing significant resource to try to make sure that we make right perhaps where we've missed opportunities in the past prior to our more recent changes. I hope that makes sense, Chair, in the first instance.
I heard what you said. If I can just pick up a couple of them. I mean, the appalling way it has been dealt with has been highlighted by the HMI, also by Casey. The fact that things haven't been logged properly. You mentioned flagging system. I was phoned by a police officer saying up until quite recently there were no flagging system in place, and it should have been. When you've had reports done, all of these things have come to light. You say that you hope that people will come and see you. These girls have been treated so badly by the police, and you know what a police supporter I am. There isn't a greater police supporter than me.
Of course.
However, I've been horrified, absolutely horrified, by many of the stories I've told by the victims and how badly they've been treated by the police. You kindly offered for the girls that have come to me and spoken to me for me to send you their cases. Only one of them trusted the police enough for me to give their details over. This is how bad it has been. So you've got a dreadful reputation, and I think all police forces has. I'm not just saying the Met, but of course we're talking about the Met today because we're talking about London. You've got such a dreadful reputation for how you have, as in the police force, have treated these poor girls, that they don't trust the police enough to come forward. And that is shocking in itself. One of the things I keep picking up is that you have said and others have said, grooming gangs as the public would know them. Well, you tell me, what do you think the public think a grooming gang is?
Forgive me for speaking on behalf of the wider public. It's not my place to do so, but I would imagine many would think of the instances that we've sadly seen in areas like Rotherham and Rochdale, which have achieved such media coverage in recent times. We have large numbers of usually older male suspects targeting younger female suspects systematically and over time within a community.
Yep. Yeah, and I think the big difference in London is that they're not all from one community. They're from very many communities, absolutely, in London, to reflect the population of London. So they're the same sort of gangs, certainly in my experience, talking to so many victims or survivors. But the difference is the ethnicity in London does seem to be far more varied. I certainly would say that. But that is what we're talking about when we're all talking about grooming gangs, and I assume that's why the national look at this is going to be referring to grooming gangs as the public know it, because that reflects it. I know many academics want to call it something else, but we need to be calling it what the actual public think of it is, and that way it focuses minds on what people think. I fully accept, and I'm sure the rest of the panel do, there are very many, sadly, different aspects to child abuse, and would that there wasn't. It's horrific, but we're concentrating on what the public and what these poor victims see as grooming gangs. So it's the Met's official position that you have underestimated the level of grooming gang activity in London. And how long do you think that this has been going on?
No, it's not our official position that we've underestimated it, Chair. I think the challenge that we have in this space is that, as you've rightly articulated yourself, the dangers in child sexual exploitation is a great many children who are affected by such horrific offences are exploited and abused to such a degree that sometimes they don't even know themselves. They think it's a normalised behaviour. If you take, for instance, the boyfriend model of abuse, all too often we find ourselves in situations where it takes a long time before a child or even police intervention before they realise that they have been abused in this manner. Hidden harm, therefore, is a significant part of the underreporting that we see in this space. So it's not that we've underestimated the scale in terms of what's reported to us, it's what we don't know and can't know unless people come forward. And if I may, it would be poor of me to not hark back to your point earlier about the individual female victims who've spoken to yourselves during the course of your own inquiries. As you know, yes, we did chair right to your office to say, is there anyone who'd be willing to speak to us? And you kindly referred one lady to us. Thankfully, that case was known to us and the case was already under investigation. But if there are others who either are listening today or would like to make themselves known to us, or your officer yourself feel able to, needless to say, it's a matter of public safety, not just for them, but for other people who may have been affected by their abuser, that I would ask them to take that step, find the confidence in us if they can, notwithstanding the shortfalls of what may have gone before, not just on behalf of themselves, but on behalf of other potential future victims. So if I may just make that appeal to them through you and to anyone listening, or indeed to anyone else, we are a very changed policing organisation from where we have been in previous years. And it's not to say that everything before was done badly. There were some good examples of cases brought to justice, some of which have made public record. But the fact of the matter is, Her Majesty's Inspectorate and others did call out the fact that there was too much use of victim-blaming language, too much value judgment on the lifestyles of young people, and indeed of sexual victim survivors more broadly. And the Met has gone on an extraordinary journey in that space, that cultural transformation, the training of 23,000 people in everything from avoiding adultification to avoiding victim-blaming, which I've personally led myself, led to HMI coming back and actually complimenting us on the immense strides that we had made. In fact, they indicated they were surprised by the progress we had made in that space. To this day, I routinely check our daily crime bulletins every single day, myself personally every morning, to check there isn't a shred of it in our narrative, because only when we stamp out such microaggressions where we place a value judgment on a victim survivor, where we actually encourage those children and young people, or indeed people in later life, to trust us and come forward. So we need that trust and confidence, and we need to be responding to victim survivors' concerns in a way that encourages others to come forward before we can ever truly know the scale. So it's not that we're underestimating, it's that we haven't been able to see it because of the approach that we've failed to take.
The trouble is trust and confidence has to be earned.
Of course.
And this is half the problem. So would you say your officers now would recognise the boyfriend model more as opposed to ignoring it?
Indeed.
And when has this massive change in the Met taken place? Because when Casey was looking at it a couple of years ago, it was very bad. The HMI report is only a couple of years old. So when do you think these differences took place? It's
been in the last few years, effectively since 2022, and you'll be aware, I'm sure, Chair, that the Commissioner led his New Met for London 1 and 2 phases. New Met for London 2 training is actually what led to the 23,000 strong rollout of the Soteria first responder training. So that's where all of our first responding officers and staff, from call handlers in our control room through to frontline ERT officers, got specialist training in how best to respond to victims of sexual violence in that critical first moment when they make that step to contact us. Likewise, all officers and staff given essential training in how to avoid seeing children as anything other than children, what we call the child-first approach, and to make sure that we don't inadvertently adultify particularly young black and non-white children, which we know was previously a phenomenon which set back our ability to draw in those who might need to report to us. So it has been a phenomenal undertaking, but one that I know that the Commissioner and all the top team at the Met are very proud of. We know that the reporting from frontline officers and staff who've been through that training has been incredibly successful, with significantly higher personal confidence in their ability to identify the boyfriend model or how to see a child first. So we hope to see that translate onto the ground in how victims perceive us now. So tell me, if the Met has got so good at this now, do we have grooming gangs going on at the moment? We do. There are always active investigations into... Always active investigations? Always has been, into group-based child sex abuse and exploitation, which is what we would refer to as organised group-based child sexual exploitation. And when that occurs, of course, and the Commissioner previously said before, we have tens of these investigations at any one time. You might have heard Sir Mark use that expression at a previous committee, and that's still accurate. I've heard a lot said, Kevin, over the time. I've also had the Mayor tell me they don't exist. I've also been told that there's nothing to see here by police officers before. Well, other police officers are telling me that things aren't being flagged properly. Victims are telling me that they were ignored constantly. And so you'll forgive me until I don't get phone calls like the ones I do. I'm still quite sceptical. I'm sure some of that will be brought out later by colleagues. I think I'll go straight on now to Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, panel. Commander Southwood, Kevin, this is a question for you. Now, I don't want to get caught up in the issue of terminology, but you will have seen, and the public will have seen, the last session that we had in this investigation where academics who work with victims organisations who support victims unanimously said that the term grooming gangs is not useful because it means that victims fall through the gaps. It means perpetrators also fall through the gaps in terms of being brought to justice. And you quite rightly said that the centre of any of this is about the victims. Could you just explain again to this panel and therefore to London on a wider basis through this committee why the term grooming gangs is unhelpful?
Of course, with pleasure. Thank you for the question. The grooming gangs label can often make people think of instances, as we sadly saw in Rotherham and other areas, where you have several hundred, I think it was, offenders targeting a great many victims over an extended period of time in what is a hugely public outraging example of child sexual exploitation at scale. So, for instance, to talk too liberally about such an awful phenomenon as if it occurs on a daily basis in that scale and quantity would, of course, create public concern in the first instance that may not be justified to that degree. All child sexual exploitation, single instance or otherwise, group-based, is utterly abhorrent, and every single individual instance demands that attention and not to fall through the gaps. Therefore, we're as equally focused on single instance child sex abuse and exploitation cases as we are on those, can I say, more complex and organised cases, of which there are tens of in the city at any one time. But we do our best across all of that spectrum to make sure that we safeguard all victim survivors out of harm's way and make sure that we bring all offenders to justice. Within this as well, the sheer complexity of the world we're in now won't be lost on any of the panel or indeed any of the audience watching. So without straying into rhetoricals, because you're asking the questions, not me, if I would start posing questions to you about what you think a grooming gang actually is, we'd probably have varied views amongst the panel and amongst the audience here today and anybody watching. Because if you think about things like sextortion, modern-day sextortion, which comes in about already multiple 13 or 14 different crime types exercised, perhaps online, perhaps in person, perhaps bridging from online into the real world through contact offending. If that involves more than one offender, is that then a gang, a virtual gang that's exploiting? Is it a grooming gang? Certainly grooming is taking place. Certainly child sexual exploitation is occurring. But what actually constitutes that grooming gang? If we group that in, do we then start to look at the roughly 2,000 to 3,000 offences we get every year in the online child sexual exploitation space and term them all grooming gangs? Now, we might choose to do so, but if we did, do we then spark the concern in some members of the public that we're talking about 3,000 Rotherhams? And of course, that's not the case, and that would be misleading and concerning. We try to be scientific and professional about what we do in the Metropolitan Police Service and deal with these cases absolutely proportionally and in a way that surgically cleaves us to the best opportunity to safeguard children and bring offenders to justice. Whether it's lone, group, matters not to us. Does that help?
Thank you very much. And again, to emphasise, the question is asked because I do not want victims to fall through the gaps, and I certainly do not want perpetrators not being brought to justice because of the terminology that may or may not be used. Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
I'd like to now extend a warm welcome to the students from Latimer Upper School in Hammersmith and students from Haberdashers Hatcham College in New Cross. It's a great pleasure to have you with us. So we'll continue. Assembly Member Ahmed, do you want to ask question 2?
Thank you very much. Again, Commander Southworth, to you. How is the Met's social media and intelligence network helping to increase the understanding and prevent the use of online platforms by offenders to contact children in London?
Thank you very much again. The actual platform in question, I think, is referring to a platform that was put in place around county lines particularly. I should make clear that I think funding for that ceased in the end of March this year, so it isn't playing the same role that it did prior to spring this year. However, the capability that it represented has been absorbed into our Metropolitan Police intelligence teams and continues to do it all that we can on what we call a triple I basis, which is intelligence internet investigations basis, to identify platforms and users of those platforms that may pose a risk across a range of threat types, whether it's criminal county lines exploitation, child sexual exploitation or other. Our online child sex abuse and exploitation teams are also, of course, extremely adept at working with the National Crime Agency and even international partners to identify platforms and online forums where people may be seeking to groom or otherwise coerce children into either criminal or sexual exploitation. There is exhaustive work done there, which in some instances I would need to brief the panel on separately and out of session, but which provides a fantastic insight and routinely yields several thousand cases a year, which are brought to justice through our investigations. So the digital front of this is far bigger than just the SMIN, the original question. It is something which we're tackling on all fronts, and we're increasingly aware that in every investigation we do now, and especially in sexual offences, the digital forensic and the open source internet investigation side of the inquiry is now as substantial as the real world one. So we have moved into a very different space of investigation.
And thank you. And you've touched on this and about the vastness of the online space. And you know that doesn't matter what we do, you know, that people are all online, and the perpetrators online are ahead of us. Just in terms of national and international boundaries, how is the Met keeping up with ensuring that children and young people can be kept safe in that space?
It's a phenomenal and burgeoning area of challenge for us. But I would say, if I may, Assemblymember Ahmed, that we'd never concede to the fact that they're ahead of us. We actually do like to think we're keeping pace. And they may think they're ahead of us, but as the statistics show, every year we pull in 2,000 to 3,000 of these offenders and offences and actually bring them to justice. So anyone who's out there thinking that they're hiding behind their keyboard and committing an act of either sexual grooming or online child sexual exploitation needs to think again. In fact, my entreaty to them would be to stop what you're doing and seek help from Lucy Faithful or one of the other charitable trusts that can assist you in desisting from your offending. At the end of every one of those offences, even if it feels virtual, there is a child suffering the most abhorrent torture, whether that's in a far-flung part of the world or otherwise. The work that we do in this space is, and I say it not that I'm doing it, but by very capable and expert colleagues who are, is very impressive. The victim identification work we do using new AI technologies to identify child victims wherever they are in the world, to safeguard them, to identify first-generation online material which may indicate direct filming of an offence wherever that may be, to tackle things such as live streaming of abuse, any number of different phenomena that burgeon in that space is a continuing endeavour and one which will increasingly widen. The societal call to arms on this, if I may, and it is a societal problem, not just one that we can police our way out of, is far wider. I've said previously at the London Policing Board, and I'll say it again here if I may, such is the scale, and let's not forget that the National Crime Agency's conservative estimate is that there are 850,000 adults in this country with some sort of a sexual interest in children, according to the data that they possess, many of whom will be working in concert, which raises this question again of what is organised and what is a group. As I say, we will tend not to overly worry about the differentiation. We'll just take the whole. And within that, we'll deploy every piece of toolkit we have in our armoury in order to bring those offenders to justice. But the ask, I suppose, from us as law enforcement would be manifold. On the one lens, I think we need to work through panels like this, through the Home Office, through big tech, to actually work on how we can work with their algorithms to try to stymie the flow of this material and identify those that we need to bring to justice, much as we do through the current referral system working with international partners. There's then a piece around how we help to divert those who may be heading into this space, who see sexual violence online as something that is now normalised. Perhaps a generation coming through who are desensitised to what they see online, especially young and vulnerable people who may then find themselves subject to sexual exploitation. This is a complex field, but one that we're applying all of our thoughts to, and we're achieving great successes in many ways, as I articulated before. Our numbers of offenders brought to justice for indecent imagery of children has gone up significantly from last year by about 60%. Our numbers of child sexual exploitation offences brought to justice charged this year has tripled. Our number of rape charges has quadrupled. So in almost all fronts, we are putting down a lot of firepower to bring offenders to justice, but the scale is big. And that's where I think we need that broader societal discussion, if I may.
Thank you, Commander, and thank you for, I don't often say this, thank you for correcting me on the issue of the Met being ahead of offenders, and I think that's a really important message, and thank you for making that very clear. AI is everywhere, as you know, and sadly also in the online space. Can I ask you what the Met's doing on the prevention side that includes AI-generated abuse imagery. And a message and a question for you, Deputy Mayor or Mr. Krishnan. What is how are you, as MOPAC, supporting and assuring that work as online grooming sadly grows?
Thank you. And artificial intelligence is one of those things we bandied the term around a lot already, don't we, without many of us really understanding its full capability, and I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in it. However, having said that, we have already seen instances, an investigation we ran earlier this year where nudification apps were being utilised with artificial intelligence software. That led to some very speedy work, I'm pleased to say, with actually Home Office partners and others to encourage some legislation into place, which actually meant that one of the major platforms that was hosting this AI software was actually legislated against, and consequently was unable to use that within the United Kingdom. That, for me, was a really good example, without going into too much detail, of how if we're fleet of foot and agile in this space that can work with government, Home Office and big tech, we can perhaps work together to iron out the threat before we have to A, see people victimised by it, and B, then reactively investigate it. Much better if we can stop the harm in the first place. And that's where I think the use of AI from our point of view could be extremely effective in terms of weaponising it against our enemies in this to prevent abuse and victimisation in the first place, or indeed to make sure we bring it to justice when it does, and to legislate against its misuse in the way that we need to. Because otherwise the danger is, if AI tools are routinely available, the risk is that all the offenders I just talked about, the many hundreds of thousands, simply access it and commit abuse using AI software, which is just as dangerous in terms of what that could lead them to do in the future as any other form of contact offending. Because, of course, someone who satisfies their appetites in that manner might eventually turn to contact offending. So there's a worrying paradigm there that it could encourage, in much the way algorithms have, a massive exponential proliferation in those who have such sordid sexual appetites. So how we tie that off and stymie it is key. How we respond to it reactively is key. And it's definitely something that we as policing need to work with Home Office, Department for Science and Technology and others, and then big tech, in order to truly tie off.
Thank you. And Deputy Mayor, Mr Balakrishnan, either of you, would you like to respond to the MOPAC part of that?
Thank you, Assembly Member Ahmed. I'll start, and then Will do feel free to add. The Mayor and I really recognise that in all forms of violence against women and girls now, there is some form of tech enabling, and that's why you will have seen that we had earlier this year an international conference on tech-enabled VOG, working with UCL and actually bringing big tech companies into City Hall, but also bringing partners from around the world to have a discussion on this new frontier of violence. We are really concerned about the way in which tech is being weaponized in all forms of violence against women and girls, but definitely in the sexual exploitation space. That's why the Mayor's announced a £6 million fund to increase the amount of support available to victims, survivors of tech-enabled VOG, and we'll be working closely with the sector, not only to make sure that victim support is there, led by victims, but also working with tech companies so that they can help design out from source the weaponization of tech, but also to make sure, moreover, that we're working closely with the Violence Reduction Unit, that we are tackling the growing concerns around the manosphere and ensuring that we're doing that preventative work primarily with boys, but also with girls, about healthy relationships and how we can reduce the extreme harms that we are now seeing online. Will, do you want to add?
I think that's really comprehensive. The only other thing I'd say is, whilst we really welcome the new investment, I think it's fantastic the Mayor is investing in further support for those who've experienced tech-enabled VOG. Today, whether you're an adult or a child, our services will support you as a victim survivor, regardless of whether that offending or that victimisation happened online or in person. So, people don't have to wait. And whichever service you call, because it's a sort of ecosystem, you will get to the right place.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. And I was pleased to see, Kevin, that you said you like working through panels like this. Unfortunately, since the London Policing Board has been established, we see less and less of police officers at our meetings, which is regrettable, I would say. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Good morning, panel. I can't believe my ears to sit here. I find it beyond weird, in fact, infuriating. Can't imagine how infuriating it would be for victims to talk about the fact we shouldn't say grooming gangs, because that would alert the public to have more public concern than they should about a gang sexually exploiting a child. I think the public can understand that, be it murder, be it any sort of crime, there might be crimes that are slightly more horrific in terms of scale and what's happened, but they can distinguish that if you are saying there are grooming gangs in London, that might not necessarily mean as many children or as many perpetrators have been affected. That doesn't make those cases any less disgusting, any less shocking, and the public outrage rightly is right. And to sit there and pretend that the word grooming gang would let victims slip through the net when it's been institutional failure over decades that has let those girls slip through the net, people find that galling. You can surely, Kevin, Deputy Assistant Commissioner, you can surely understand that.
No, I understand your point completely, and nothing we say here today should ever trivialise the issue that's being raised here. My point is a simple one, if I may, which is we prefer more precise terminology. Group-based child sexual exploitation, organised, is the sort of terminology that we utilise around this, precisely because of the subjectivity, is my point, is that all child sexual exploitation is abhorrent, and especially when it's systematic and large-scale. When I talked about public concern, what I meant by that was the point about a Rotherham-type situation where you have several hundred offenders, several hundred victims, the risk of people applying that sort of model to any instance of the reference of word grooming gang. So we're just trying to be precise in our language so we don't create more public concern. It is not for 1 second to suggest that any one case, individual or group, is anything less than absolutely appalling, or that the suffering of victims is in any way minimised, and our hearts go out to them.
Well, I think you should give the public more credit than that to be able to understand that not every single case is going to be the same. Of course, every case is going to be different. And to say that we should use, I think you said group-based child sexual offences organised, and to think that's a term that the public are going to use day to day, when essentially what you're using is corporate legal language for grooming gang, I don't see the fight over that. That seems absolutely irrelevant when we're talking about institutional failure and serving justice to these girls. I think it's beyond weird to me, but as I say, infuriating as well. And I'm glad you've made clear that the words are not the problem here. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I'm probably adding to the debate that we should be talking about words when we shouldn't. I couldn't let that pass by.
No, I think it's a really important point, and if I may, I absolutely agree. We should give the public credit to be able to differentiate between such things. But I will say this, as the lead for this for the Metropolitan Police Service, I routinely make sure I see everything that's communicated into and out of the organisation, Freedom of Information Act requests, media requests, stories that come in, and actually tracking this narrative. I have to say, there are sections of the society that would seek to use that term in a way that would cause more concern than is perhaps justified in some instances. So within that, we need to be careful that what is all about victim survivors for us as the Metropolitan Police Service, what is all about making sure that we safeguard our public, whether individually or from group-based offending, doesn't become something different in the eyes of others.
It's really hard to hear you say the words more concern than necessary in response to cases of gang-based sexual abuse of children, whatever level. That's really, I don't think we can agree on that. It's always going to be concerning. I think even one case, one person, individual, it's always going to be the case that most rightly enrages the public, and I think that's fair enough.
I understand. And for clarity, we're not telling the public not to use that term. It's not our place to do so. The public and the media will use the terms they use, and we understand that. All I'm saying is that as a professional police officer in this space, I'm charged with the responsibility of understanding the scale of the threat in all its forms, so we have to use terminology which is accurate.
Well, of course, that a grooming gang isn't an offence you're going to arrest someone on. So we understand that. So, OK, as long as we can get to the bottom of that. Thanks. Deputy Mayor, the committee heard evidence earlier in this thematic review that there are grooming gangs operating in London similar to those in Rotherham. We've also heard, and Kevin, I'll choose your words carefully because I think you've chosen them carefully, but you say there are cases that would be closest to what the public understand as grooming gangs operating in London. You've also said that we should be aware of their prevalence and the risk. Deputy Mayor, therefore, are we now at a place where, as a mayoral team, when the Mayor said in June 2025 there are no reported cases or indication of these sorts of grooming gangs in the capital, are you and the Mayor now in a place where you can reflect that that comment was incorrect?
I want to be very clear that the Mayor and myself think that all forms of sexual abuse of children, whether it be individual, groups or grooming gangs, is absolutely abhorrent, that we stand with the victims and we want to work with the police and our other agencies to make sure that we're doing all we can to bring these perpetrators to account and make sure that there's justice for victims. We know...
Did you hear my question, Deputy Mayor? Do you want me to repeat the question?
No,
again?
I'm answering your question.
So the question was that the Mayor said in June 25 there are no reported cases or indication of these sorts of grooming gangs in London. Would you now reflect that that comment was incorrect?
As you and DAC Southworth were just discussing, I think we know that there is, in London, we have not seen the specific pattern which we saw elsewhere in the country, like Rochdale and Rotherham. However, we also want to be very clear that we want complete transparency, complete accountability. We want the Met and all our statutory services to do all we can to follow all the evidence available and bring perpetrators of any form of sexual abuse towards children, whether it be group-based or individual, to justice.
Deputy Mayor, I'll reflect again that the Deputy Assistant Commissioner has said that there are cases in London that would be closest to what the public understand as grooming gangs. We've heard his definition of grooming gangs and that it largely reflects what he believes the public thinks. So that the Deputy Assistant Commissioner has said they exist. He says they've been prevalent and we're aware of the risks. Are you sitting next to him now and still saying you don't think those operate in London?
No, I'm saying, and I want to be very clear.
Okay, so you're not saying that.
Assembly Member Best, I am being very clear.
No, you're not being clear at all, I'm afraid, Deputy Mayor.
If you let me, Chair, I would really like to answer this question. This is very important. We are talking about the sexual abuse of children. The Mayor and I are unequivocal in our support for the Metropolitan Police. It's why the Mayor spoke to HMIC in 2023 and raised concerns about how the Met was approaching investigations around child abuse, and it's why the Metropolitan Police has moved forward in their recommendations on that investigation. The Mayor has always prioritised making sure that victim survivors of child abuse or any form of sexual violence is a priority. It's why the Lighthouse was set up, which is a national leading organisation that has seen 2,000 survivors of child sexual abuse.
You're not answering
supported.
the question. You're giving a statement on something you want to answer, Deputy Mayor. I don't want to interrupt you, but I really would like you to answer the questions. So can you answer the question? Because it is really, really important. If you want the public to believe that the Met has the Mayor's unequivocal response, then I think you should admit that the statement that he made last year was incorrect. That would be a great start. If you could say that here today, that would mean a lot to the public, that would mean a lot to survivors.
The Mayor has never denied or downplayed the importance of us supporting the Metropolitan Police in following any form of evidence on child sexual exploitation, whether that be individual, group or grooming gangs.
It wasn't downplaying it to say there are no reported cases or indication of these sorts of grooming gangs in London. That wasn't downplaying it.
Assembly Member Best, you have just had a discussion with DAC Southworth about the complexity of using these terms. We want to make sure that the victim survivors of child sexual abuse are at the forefront of the work that we are doing. We have been very clear, and it's actually why working with Operation Beacon Port, we have been very clear with the Metropolitan Police Service. We want full transparency. The initial trawl that has been put into the public domain of 12,000 cases we made sure that that number was put into the public domain because we want to make sure that we are being transparent about this. Nothing is more important to myself and the Mayor than protecting children. And we fully support the Metropolitan Police Service in doing that. We commission various services, I know we're going to have questions on that later, to make sure that we are victim-led and that we are doing all we can to bring these abhorrent perpetrators to justice.
It's bizarre that you don't want to call it a grooming gang. It's bizarre you say it didn't exist a year ago. And then it's bizarre to try and talk about everything else other than the question. Deputy Mayor, you're not going to answer the question, so I'll leave it there.
Well, sorry does seem to be the hardest word, doesn't it? Why on earth don't you just say, yes, the Mayor was mistaken? We know that it's very important to you. Of course it is. We know it's important to everybody. The fact is that lots of kids have dropped through this and have not been attended to properly. The Metropolitan Police have got a lot to answer for. But my colleague was actually referring to the Mayor saying that there weren't these sort of gangs there. Now, is that because he was told that by the Metropolitan Police or by MOPAC? Or did he get it wrong? If he got it wrong, just say he got it wrong. We'll move on.
We have had for years conversations with the Metropolitan Police Service and our Commission Service. I have led conversations myself with statutory services in local authorities and the criminal justice system.
We're talking about what the Mayor said. Why on earth can't you just answer the question? What is the matter with you? There are girls and boys being raped. All I wanted to know a couple of years ago was, do these rape gangs exist in London? That was the question. And we were told by the Mayor in a Mayor's question time that those sort of gangs did not exist. Commander Southworth has just said, yes, they do exist. We all know they exist. I know they exist. I've spoken to the poor victims of it. All we're trying to get from you is the comment, yes, that comment from the Mayor was incorrect, but you are incapable of actually saying that. We'll move on, because if not, you'll just read what's been put in front of you yet again,
I'm sorry,
which is very
Chair,
frustrating.
You have asked me to come to this committee to answer questions on an exceptionally important topic.
It is important.
If you are asking me a question, I would like to respond. And in my response, I am very clear that we have been told that we must look at the whole picture. DAC Southworth has just said that to you, that no victim should feel unsupported, and that we have done the work with the Metropolitan Police to make sure to improve the services that those victims get. It is very important that we are clear with the public that they should have the full trust and confidence that any form, including gangs, of abuse.
How can anybody have trust and confidence when people we're putting questions to can't answer a simple question? Let's move on, because we're getting nowhere with you here.
The Mayor has never denied or downplayed the importance of this issue.
The next section is on the scale of grooming gangs in London, and the questioning will start from Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to DAC Southworth. It has been reported that 4,000 of the Met's closed cases of group-based child sexual exploitation and abuse have met the criteria to be reviewed. Why were so many cases closed with no further action taken?
Thank you for the question, Assembly Member Small Edwards. I believe you're referring to reporting in, I think it was the Times newspaper. Was that where the figure 4,000 came from? Just to set it in its rightful context. So forgive me, just to say from the outset, that's not a figure that we have released. So I can't speak for the Times as to where that number actually came from. What I can say is that the original quota that I referred to earlier of approximately 12,000 CSE offences that would fit the criteria have now come down to a far lower number, which is in several thousands, which has gone back to the National Crime Agency for their review. Just to be clear on what that actually means, I won't repeat the definition I gave before because it takes up the Assembly's time, but you heard me mention what the actual criteria were in terms of more than one offender, etc. Within that, then, there are the different crime classifications that I've alluded to as well in terms of different categories, and then within that, multiple different classifications. Going back so many years, the no further action rate was probably higher than it should have been, if I'm candid with you, and all the reasons that are being discussed here today are relevant to this. The journey that I spoke of in terms of the Metropolitan Police's improvement on this post the HMI inspection these last 4 years has brought us on leaps and bounds in terms of understanding the plight of victims better than perhaps we ever did. I think across society, but certainly in policing, in the courts, everywhere in our CJ system, unfortunately, there was a paradigm in place prior to that where too much value judgment was placed on how victims had conducted themselves. Too many instances where someone was deemed to have, and these are not my words, but a chaotic lifestyle. Someone had been taking drink and drugs. Someone had been, and again, these are not my words, Assembly, so forgive me, someone had been sleeping with older men. Too much focus on the victim and their account and their, can I use the word credibility here, not in a way I ever want repeated, because we've come away from that concept completely. Under the Operation Soteria transformation, which I've personally led within the Met, and we've had nationally leading through Professor Catherine Hall and others academically led work, we now take what we call a suspect-focused approach, whereby we always make sure we put the investigative focus where it rightly belongs on those who are accused of the crime, rather than looking too closely, more than we should have in the past, at the victim's account. Because we know that Lakes victims, much like the Chair said a moment ago, feel like they were the ones under investigation, though they were the ones coming forward and actually revealing their horror to us. So the whole training exercise that I spoke about earlier, the 23,000, the first responder training, there's so much more than I can explain to you here today, but we'd more than happily, of course, host any number of the Assembly members in slower time to talk through it in greater detail, has been about exactly that. How do we make sure we give every victim survivor's case the best possible chance of seeing a criminal justice outcome, making sure they're safeguarded? And to do that, of course, we need to make sure that we start off with an absolute willingness to believe, an objective investigation of the facts, but very much a focus on the suspect. And I think prior to 2022, in that number that you've referred to, there will have been instances, I've no doubt we'll find them in Operation Beacon Port, where victim survivors will feel they either weren't believed or they were judged. And for that, I'm sincerely sorry to them. And I extend apologies on behalf of all of the Met. Now is the chance, though, for us to make that right for them. And we're actively going back with Operation Beacon Port, with the NCA, to look across all those crimes and think, which of those crimes do we need to look at again? Do we need to reopen, reinvestigate, and recontact that victim survivor to see if we can perhaps recover justice for them? Does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you very much for that response. But, I mean, you mentioned the year 2022, so it's not a huge amount of time, really, we're talking about. It's not decades ago we're talking about. It's relatively recent history. Why do you think this level of victim judgment and victim blaming existed quite so recently within the Met?
And, well, if I may, it's not the Met alone. I think we're all citizens of society as well, aren't we? I sit here as a police officer, but we all live in this world. It won't be lost on any of you here. There's been a societal epiphany these last years, not least through a number of high-profile cases, but also just through a general. You look at Everyone's Invited, the Me Too campaign, really in a period of sort of the early 2020s, I think the whole world woke up to the fact that for far too long, violence against women and girls in particular has not been prioritised in the way that it should have been as a society at every level. And I think that epiphany, sadly, has come far too late for so many of these victim survivors because it impacts on everything. The way that we approach our victim survivors, the way that courts and the CJ system treat them. We're still now wrestling with some of the fallout from many years of situations where, as the Chair has rightly said, many victims feel they either weren't believed or weren't supported. So there is a mountain to climb in terms of that trust and confidence. And it's a mountain we've only begun to climb really in the last 4 to 5 years. But we are significant strides up it now, as attested by all the figures I gave you before and all the training that we've mentioned. So it is fairly recent that not just the Met, but the whole of society woke up to the risks that so many women and girls and children have been subjected to. But I'm pleased to say we're making very strong headway in that space. And this is why now more than ever we need the support of this panel, we need the support of the public, we need the support of our partners and our commission services to help any child or victim survivor, grown up or otherwise, to come forward so that we can solve their case for them and bring their offender to justice.
Thank you. So you're confident then that within the Met, that level of victim blaming is no longer happening and wouldn't exist in the future?
I can confidently say that we dip sample now on a regular basis and routinely find no victim blaming in our reporting. At the same time, it is something that we need to be ever vigilant about. We have a very large workforce, we have a very large partner workforce. We work with the Crown Prosecution Service and with the courts. We're all on this journey together. It is, and I'll say this as a professional in the field of nearly 30 years now, it is all too easy for any of us to perhaps form a judgment in our minds if we're not careful. And ultimately that vigilance needs to remain within all of us, that we're constantly looking and thinking, am I focusing in the right way here, making sure that we're investigating the suspect and not questioning the victim in this? So it's something we need to remain constantly vigilant to, but it's something we've done exhaustive training on. And I'm as confident as I can be that we're doing everything we can to make sure that every victim gets the right experience of the service from the Met, irrespective of the outcome. Because not every outcome will end in a court, but we do want victims to know that they have been believed and they will be trusted.
Dear Southworth, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Assembly Member Duval.
Thank you very much. Look, I've got a couple of sets of questions around the figure of 4,000. And look, I get it, what you're saying in terms of how did we arrive there, and that issue of victim blaming could, and the chaotic lifestyle, is this worth pursuing or not? I get that. But it's a bit more complex than that. After 4,000, can you just tell us where the current status is? Because something you said, I thought they were being slowly worked through. Are you just implying that they've just been highlighted back to the NCA and work is yet to happen around that figure? Where is the status of these reviews?
Of course. And if I may, Assemblymember Duval, I should say that the 4,000 isn't an official figure. That's just been reported in the press.
Yeah.
But I'll work with that, if I may, because it's not a million miles out from where we are.
Less.
Sure. So the 12,000 that were originally withdrawn, we had a body of about 128,000 offences that would have fitted the criteria originally if you just did a data pull from the system looking for more than one suspect, etc. So you have that vast amount of data over 15 years' worth of investigations, some of which have been reported and predate that as well. So it's an immense exercise we're going through. There's clearly no way of manually reviewing all of those investigation case files and crime reports. That in itself would take many years and many officers and staff to do so. So the first exercise was just to make sure that we go through and actually check we have actually drawn the data correctly and they do fit that criteria. Because, I mean, forgive me, you've been on this panel a long time, so you will know some of the challenges we face in that space. Our old suspect pages on the old crime reporting system would have a page created for a forensic ident, and then, of course, that may then be reconfirmed when a suspect is actually arrested. Suddenly it looks like there's two people there. It takes someone to manually review that to work out there's actually only one suspect, just 2 pages were created. That sort of nuance needed to be ironed out. That's what's led it down from the 12,000 to the much lower figure that is erroneously reported but isn't far wrong. That now goes back to the National Crime Agency. The NCA are working with TOEX and Hydrant and all the other national partners on this, are going to look at all those cases. And I can't speak for the NCA. I would need the director, who I spoke to just the other night, here alongside me to really speak to what they're going to do, because it's a National Crime Agency lead, so it's not for me to say. But we'll be using their capabilities and their national analytical tools to look at these offences and see which, if any, may have other opportunities around them, which gives us the potential to have a fantastic lens on that body of crime reporting. And the very great hope of ourselves and the NCA is that on the other side of this immense exercise we're all undergoing nationally, we'll have the best picture that we've perhaps never had of what the true scale of child sexual exploitation may be. But within that as well, it's true to say, no, we have not gone back through all of those several thousand line by line, because that itself, to recover all the case papers, all the relevant material, would be a monumental exercise taking hundreds of officers and staff. So we're going to work with the National Crime Agency. They're going to set further criteria. I'm not quite sure how it's going to manifest yet. I'll have to refer to them for that. And they will then come back to us and say, Kevin, we think you need to look at this many percentage of your number, and you need to reinvestigate those in full. We will also, in the meantime, be going through what we think are the most concerning ones ourselves, and then drawing them out. We won't wait for the NCA to tell us. We're going to start reactively investigating those immediately now, which is why I say anyone who's affected by this, please do come forward and flag to us. So we're coming at it from both ends, systematically from the NCA perspective with that national lens and capability, and locally with our own eyes. What can we see ourselves within that body that's so concerning that we're just not even going to wait, we're just going to get on with it?
Okay, so in that figure and the criterias that you outlined in the answer to the first question,
of course,
have we got a breakdown of the several thousands that you've got of where they fit into the different categories?
Certainly.
Do we also have them on a geographical basis in London? Because I say this because, look, I do somewhat agree with you about the attitudinal and cultural issues of officers thinking, is this going to go anywhere? Also having a mind, well, the CPS would take it up. What's the chances of a conviction? And I welcome that you've changed that approach. I welcome you've changed that approach. That doesn't mean there's going to be justice for victims, because they've got an old court justice system to go through in some cases. But nevertheless, but but the Met has made a number of changes over those 12 years. Now, at a time, I remember many years ago asking your colleagues about screening out crimes and what sort of crimes we're screening out. Now, of course, there's the Met inconsistency of this. Some of your senior officers, I think, were very wise and didn't screen out violent crimes or sexual crimes or some issues. Is there an argument here about these several thousands that we might have, that this was part of a screening out of crimes process that's also led to this position of where these crimes were not followed up if there were potential leads?
I'm certainly not aware of that as a phenomenon, but until we've done the review work, I should leave that question and perhaps respond in due course once Beacon Port and ourselves have a chance to review these exhaustively. What I would say is screening out, and forgive me, you've been on this assembly before, so with me, so you'll know more better than others what it will mean. But screening out is where a primary investigation of a report goes on, and actually it's deemed that there's insufficient to even justify a secondary investigation, so it's screened out straight away. I can say firsthand that should not happen with any sexual offence investigation, and never should have. So ultimately, if that was the case, then there'd be a challenge for us there in terms of how we address that going forwards. So certainly I'm not aware of it. It shouldn't be happening that way. Sexual offences are, by definition, very serious, and ultimately, therefore, should always be screened in for a secondary investigation for the most part, unless there's some reason to suggest that that's not necessary. So it wouldn't be a screening out policy per se. In terms of, though, I think the wider point is how, and to Assemblymember Small-Edwards' point, is the risk that so many were NFA'd, were no further actioned in too timely a manner afterwards. It is to your own point, I agree entirely. The risk was that perhaps in many cases, through no ill will, people fell into a trap of thinking, is this case actually going to be one that will make it through court? Is this victim survivor going to be able to provide evidence on the stand under cross-examination? We know that the court's process historically hasn't been the friendliest process to people who found themselves in the witness box giving evidence about their own offence. What I'm pleased to say is through the changes that we've made these last years, things are steadily improving in that regard. So you mentioned the Crown Prosecution Service. I should take a moment to thank them. We have been quite literally cheek by jowl with our CPS partners here in London in everything to do with RASO these last 4 years. I was lucky enough to work with two fantastic Deputy Chief Crown Prosecutors, Chris Venkatasamy, Lisa Ramsaranam, together, and then successor Kate Backus. We've worked together extremely collaboratively to make sure that neither we nor prosecutors make those value judgments about the merit or worth of any one victim or their case. And that is why they are charging a vastly higher number than the rest of the country in terms of cases we refer to them for rape. And we are charging now, as I say, 3, even 4 times as many as we ever have before. So you're right to be wary, sir, as the rest of the panel. The proof will be in the pudding when we see those charge rates going up. But they have gone up to such a degree that just earlier this year, at one point, the Met had gone from being almost bottom in the country to being first in the country for rape charges. And that's with the support of the Crown Prosecution Service. And we've gone as far as ourselves, myself and CPS colleagues, meeting with the presiding judges of a South London court and actually working through with them how we can potentially help to change the courtroom experience of victim survivors so that it becomes more conducive to getting their evidence out in the way that they would choose to, rather than sometimes the adversarial nature of court proceedings, which don't always feel like a rewarding experience. So we're looking at every scale of the system and certainly not screening out.
I'm looking at it from a point of view about learning lessons and making sure that we learn every lesson and not just get hooked just down one path. So that's where I'm coming from. So when will your review be complete of the several thousand outstanding cases, some that you've told us that you're dealing with, some are with the NCA that are going to tell you? And I presume they've all got some active leads that should have been followed up as one of the criteria.
It's not actually one of the criteria that there's active leads, and this is where we need to be cautious with these numbers, if I may. So the criteria are quite simple. Is there more than one suspect, contact, sexual offence, and it's no further action by either police or CPS. So it isn't to say that they've automatically got a lead in there. It may be that we look at many of these cases and, in fact, a good job was done and there's no requirement to go back and reinvestigate, which, of course, we would be careful not to, because we wouldn't want to re-traumatise the original complainant by going back and revisiting something that we cannot progress for them. But yes, to your point, wherever there is any reasonable line of inquiry, then of course we're duty-bound to make sure we follow that through, make sure we give the case the best chance of justice.
So when do we think the review will be?
The review, you forgive me if I may, I'm in the hands of the National Crime Agency as to how long they will set criteria, revert to us with the numbers. I think, and again, I'm very wary of speaking for them, forgive me, I think they're hoping to report back later this year to all forces what the consolidated numbers are, but in the meantime, the cases will begin to flow back to forces for us to reinvestigate. So it may be appropriate for us to come back in a year's time or 9 months' time or something to report.
Certainly, Chair, if we may, can we do some follow-up work on this about the categories, which I think is one of the issues of the importance of those several thousand. The geographical spread, just in case there are any managers doing different screening out processes than what was the actual Met policy, and a timeline of some of these cases. So which ones were 10 years ago, which ones are 6 years ago, or more recent in terms of that spread, in terms of where they are. I think that would be quite useful. Maybe we would return to this and follow up.
Thank you.
If I may, Lord Duval, as well, there's the categories. Some of them are in the call for evidence, so forgive me repeating them, but I think what we mean by that is those groupings.
Yeah, the groupings that you said in the first question.
Yes.
Just to elaborate, you said about the family, peer-on-peer,
Yes.
institutional, and then I thought the power relationship there and those.
Absolutely.
If they are available, then we'd like to see what the breakdown of that several thousand, because that might help in some of the earlier conversations going backwards and forwards of what people were trying to pinpoint on.
Rough percentages, if it helps. Roughly over about 40 to 45% are child sexual exploitation when there's that asymmetry of power. About just over 20% we think are peer-on-peer. Probably about 10 to 15% are intrafamilial. The reason I'm having to say about is because obviously until we get the final rationalisation of the numbers, I can't be exact. But that's the rough split we're seeing. And in fairness, we see that in other data sets that we've pulled in this space as well. So that will, I'm sure, hold true. And then there's a sort of an other category where we do see some slightly more unusual types of grooming which feature as well.
And just very quickly, do you do data on male, i.e. as in some of the county lines issues, to male-female?
Both. And,
you do that? You
absolutely.
collect that data?
And you rightly cleave to that point because there's significant overlap between child criminal exploitation, gangs, so-called hazing. There's any number of different concepts out there where we see the interplay between CCE, child criminal exploitation, and CSE, child sexual exploitation. Another factor which can sometimes make it hard to see the exact numbers because, of course, a child who may be victim as a county lines runner may not always concede to the fact they've been sexually abused as well.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I think one of the problems here is that victims saw that 9,000 cases were going to be reviewed, so they were given hope. We then read that it was 12,000 cases were going to be reviewed. We've recently looked at 4,000 cases being reviewed, and if I was watching this programme, I don't think I'd be so confident that actually some of the cases are going to be looked at. And added to that, we've got the concern of so many officers being lost in the Met at the moment. That must be affecting all of your people. So if we're looking at more and more cases coming to light, who the hell is going to deal with that? Because we're losing officers. You've got the rotation scheme, which is taking highly specialised officers out of their departments and putting them on safer neighbourhoods, which is causing almighty problems. My issue here is how on earth are you going to deal with this without the amount of staff or the resource that you need? And we must all bear that in mind because, and again, where does this put those poor girls with even less resource to sort out the issues that they've been bringing to us? The committee has heard that the true scale of grooming gang activity in London is difficult to determine, and we've heard that from the academics and from the charities. How would you assess the picture at the moment with Met? Are there areas in London that are a particular issue where they're still going on?
And forgive me, do you mind if I respond to the earlier point as well about rotation and resourcing? You surfaced a number of issues.
Because obviously we've got loads of questions to go
Of
through.
course. So, of course, resourcing is a significant concern in the Met at the moment. You might recall that Baroness Casey was quite clear in her review when this journey began with the inquiry into grooming gangs, as they term it, that ultimately it should be fully resourced by government. I should say that we won't be fully resourced to the degree that we need to be in order to do this work. So if you take the year one work on Operation Beacon Port, we were able to claim back just over £500,000 for that, according to the funding formula that we were given for this work from the resourcing. but it cost over £1.5 million. So we're already £1 million out of pocket from the Met perspective. And it's not for 1 second to suggest that that's not money well spent, because we know how critical this work is. But the fact is that £1 million has come off against the budget lines of other work that we're doing. Of course, the resources to do this work are not boundless. Trained officers to investigate, especially non-recent sexual offence investigations, do need to be highly trained. They need serious sexual assault investigation development programme courses, SIDIP as it's called, or SkyDIP if it's children. And whilst we train as many as we can, as quickly as we can, with dropping numbers overall, we are not awash with people to do this work. However, I should reassure victim survivors that we are maintaining our numbers in these critical spaces. It will become increasingly difficult because the funding formula for the reclaim of monies on Operation Beacon Put will drop. We can claim 85% back in year 1, 75% in year 2, and only 65% in year 3, which means the attritional pressure on our overall budgets will increase year on year, taking out of other areas critical resourcing. But our commitment to victim survivors is made out by things like the rotation policy, where, and I've championed this within the service myself as a former specialist in counter-terrorism and organised crime myself and other areas of the business, it's been critical to our overall journey that we move skills around the organisation. The government has rightly said that we need to apply the same sort of thinking, so that sort of counter-terrorist and serious and organised crime sort of expertise to these areas that matter most to Londoners as well. Not that CT and organised crime are not, but we need the same skills and capabilities in frontline child abuse teams and rape investigation teams. So part of rotation is about that. You are right, of course, the Met has, not in my lifetime, ever been smaller, and the city's never been bigger. That's the stark truth of it, and this will come against the backdrop of significant strain within the Met. But we will do all that we can to make sure that doing what we can for the victims of previous years doesn't come at the expense of victims today, but that will require us to move people around the service to do so, and we'll create gaps elsewhere in our ranks whilst we do so.
So,
Forgive me.
The other question was, how big do you think this issue is in London at the moment?
In terms of overall CSE,
Yeah.
group-based CSE,
What the public would know as grooming gangs.
indeed.
How bad is it in London actively at the moment? Approximately how many gangs are you looking at the moment? And
Yes.
they'd just be the ones that you know about.
Indeed. So the Commissioner's rightly gone on record before and said the number is in the tens. So it's not in the hundreds, it's in the tens. And that remains the case today. So there are, I should just set that in context, though, of course, and this is why we talked before about the level of concern around this. That is far less than 1% of our overall number of child sexual abuse and exploitation investigations within the city. So it's vital that we don't skew ourselves too much away from the many, many thousands of individual instances of child sexual abuse and exploitation that also need inquiry.
But we also know that Casey said that your data is, well, dreadful. I've forgotten what terminology she used. I know what I remember, but it was pretty bad. So, you know, if you're looking at your data, we know that the HMI and Casey have all said the data is really bad. So, taking figures from you, how much confidence can we have in that? Is there anywhere in London that you know at the moment it is particularly bad? A big geographical area? Is it worse in any area other than another?
Not in the way that would bear reporting here. Clearly, when we have double digits, tens of gangs who are active, they are in locations that we're aware of, and they're subject to live ongoing investigation. So I wouldn't want to comment on where they are, because that could obviously be breach operational security.
No, I get that.
Tip them off as to where they are, if that makes sense, Chair.
Yeah, all right then, fair enough. We'll move on. So now data on grooming gang offenders and victim survivors is going to be started off by my colleague, Assemblymember Wilson.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, panel. So we've heard in the previous sessions of this investigation that one kind of recurring theme that I think has hampered the ability to really kind of tackle this problem and hold those perpetrators to account is huge gaps in some of the historic and perhaps even current data. And the Chair has referred to sort of Casey's national audit, which found such gaps, and it's not the only thing I think that's missing, but one of the things, sort of ethnicity, nationality of perpetrators and victims, survivors. Only less than half of that data being recorded for for victims and only a third for perpetrators. So one of the previous panel members argued that makes it very difficult to draw accurate conclusions, and presumably that then makes it harder to hold those to account who need to be brought before the courts and so on. So my question really is to try and understand what is the Met doing now to make sure that the data and the intelligence that you're recording is properly, fully, accurately recorded, and how that then feeds into the investigations and ultimately the prosecutions that we want to see.
Of course. Thank you for the question, Assemblymember Wilson. And there's much work in that space. I mentioned flagging, and someone followed up on it before. I think it was the chair saying it's not where it should be. And I think that would have been indeed very fair criticism going back a few years. Whenever we're reliant on first-line responders and reporting colleagues, whether it's in control rooms or in front line, to apply a flag to a system, there's always an inherent risk of human error in that it's not applied for some reason. So that just requires constant messaging, vigilance and determined communications internally to make sure that all of our officers and staff, first of all, know how to recognise the signs and symptoms, and then which flag to make sure they put on the crime. I'm pleased to say that a recent audit has shown that's gone up to 85% successful flagging. So that's still not good enough. We want to get that closer to 100. It will never quite be 100 because of various different reasons, and especially where we see ethnicity and other factors being a factor in our data, because many of these reports will be third-party reports. In some instances, we may never see the victim or indeed identify the offender, so we can't actually apply an ethnicity code. There are some other technical barriers which I'll share with you, not to bore the committee too long, I hope. But for instance, our new Connect crime reporting system works on what they call a POL record, which is a person object location, which means if Kevin Southworth comes to light as either a victim or an offender, a nominal record is created for me, and ever thereafter, whenever I come to light in any context, any future reporting is linked to me. If at the point of the creation of my nominal record, someone doesn't put on that I'm a white British male, then fundamentally that data is lacking in any further report. So where that is the case, if you're, for instance, and this does happen, a child who goes missing repeatedly, sometimes 30, 40 times, if we haven't got your ethnicity or your other demographic factors on your original poll record, there's a risk that registers as 30, 40 instances where we haven't got the ethnicity. So that consistency in messaging is one thing, but we're also looking at a technical fix around that so we can back record, convert and improve our data over time, so we ensure that all the poll records are updated effectively. Forgive me, I know this is quite technical, but ultimately taken together between the messaging and the technical fixing, we should have a much more lucid picture as we go forward, especially with the reinvestigation work that will come, which will shed light on cases that have gone before. And then my very dear hope is that we'll have, as I've said, the best picture that we've perhaps never had of what the overall demography and makeup of child sexual exploitation looks like in our city. If that helps.
Those historic cases, you can then be updated.
Indeed.
Yeah. Okay, good. So going forwards then, you're presumably now much more confident that you are gathering and recording all this kind of data, and that hopefully, well, you talk about 85% successful flagging now, and yeah, working towards 100. Is there anything more that you need to make that happen?
It's a very gracious question. I think we've mentioned resources a moment ago. There's no doubt that if the government could follow through on Casey's recommendation, Baroness Casey's recommendation, that we're fully resourced for this, that would make an immense difference to us. We are doing this on a lesser resource than we would prefer to, and ultimately that comes with the natural hazards that are inherent in that. Perhaps it's easy for me to say.
One of the recommendations of Casey was that the collection of this data should be mandatory, so that's something you welcome and support.
Indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Assemblymember Ahmed.
That's okay, Chair. Thank you. The question has been answered.
Okay, thank you. Assemblymember Best.
Thank you. Kevin, I wondered, could you speak a little bit more about your relationship with charities and gathering evidence? We had, I don't know if you watched past the sessions before, but we did have a charity partner come and say that there has not been a collaborated approach between services, social services and police. I don't know if that's your take or you have a different view.
Thank you for the question. We've had numerous very successful collaborations with charities across a range of public protection areas over the years. So if you take, for instance...
I should say we're still on the data area, so around data collection. And, sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you meant more generally. Understood. So in data collection, forgive me, I suppose our partner agencies are key in this, of course, and referrals through from social services make up a significant number of referrals that we get. The support that we get through our commission services for victim survivors, whether that's ISVAs, whether it's refuge rape counselling, whether it is people working with the Marie Collins Foundation or Lucy Faithfull, any number of these different NGOs form a really critical part of our arsenal, because, of course, in encouraging victims and survivors to come forward and engage with us, that can maximise our data capture and improve the situation that Assemblymember Wilson alluded to a moment ago, and that the Chair did also. Encouraging victim survivors and supporting them in coming forward is arguably the battle here, because once we have them into our system, we know we can investigate their crime and support them better than we ever could before. Equipping them with the confidence and the route to come to us in that supported manner is key. But I would, if I may, perhaps just look to perhaps Will to comment on any commission services with NGOs that I may be less aware of.
I think if the question's about data, then I suppose we're sort of getting into, well, what is the role of local safeguarding boards, and what is the role of something called the London Safeguarding Executive, which is something the Mayor has funded for a number of years, and that MOPAC sits on his and the Deputy Mayor's behalf. I think what we know about CSE more generally is that no one agency is ever going to hold all the information, and that so few of those who unfortunately experience CSE are identified by professionals. So I think that's why these safeguarding executives, both for voluntary sector organisations in their areas, for professionals in those areas, why there's been such a lot of safeguarding training, such a focus on it, because without professionals being able to identify and refer on, and maybe that's what the charities were alluding to, that, you know, as a system we need to get a lot better at identifying people that we think might be experiencing CSE, reporting that, supporting them. So I wonder, sorry, apologies, Assembly Member, if that wasn't what was intended.
I guess the question is around the fact that charities have a lot of intelligence and data. Some of that, quite clearly, personal data can't be shared, and vice versa from the police, but there is that intelligence link there. And there's a number of charities, and we heard from one at this meeting, that there's a difficulty in sharing that information. You mentioned safeguarding boards, Will, and of course, that's one that people can often feel very much like you're on the outside, and there's no sharing at all. There's no intelligence going in. There's no evidence gathering apart from statutory partners that are invited to those boards. Is there a way in which we can better work with charities to gather those insights, that evidence? Again, as I say, it's really difficult to share personal data, but there's wider trends, which I'm sure they understand is what they would like to be able to share and be able to get back in a collaborative approach.
Absolutely. In heated agreement, really. Yes, thank you for the question. And I think it's as much an observation as anything. As we move forward, we definitely can take that forward. I mean, I was just reflecting on Will's comment, and we should really make sure we acknowledge the 1.2 million commitment that MOPAC has made to commission services in this space as we go forward over the next 2 years. And also the fact that the National Crime Agency work under Operation Beacon Point is going to be shaping a dedicated victim pathway, which is going to be announced this summer, to best support the victims who might be re-engaged through or come forward through the course of Operation Beacon Point. So I think, Assemblymember Best, there's a chance there for us to influence that and engage in these conversations as to which charities or commission services may be best placed to support that going forward.
So can I ask, as an
I'm so sorry, do you mind if I say something that I just think is quite important, which is through MASH, multi-agency safeguarding hubs, you can share any information about a vulnerable child. There is no information sharing barrier to doing that. If you're worried about a child, and any professionals listening or any agencies that Assembly members come in contact to, I would really like you to, make this point to them. If you're worried about a child, there is no information sharing problem. You should tell your MASH, you should make a report that allows Kevin and local authority colleagues and others in that safeguarding system to do something about it. Sorry, apologies.
Thanks. If it was always that easy for members of the public, that would be great. Unfortunately, it's maybe easier for some of us who are councillors to navigate, but not always for members of the public. But I was going to ask if there was a exercise done to see how charities wanted to work with the police, or how they think they could better work with the police to share that evidence. Is there an exercise been done to even see, instead of saying we should work, has an exercise been done to see what that would look like?
I'm not aware of one being done specifically, but it's certainly a good idea I'm happy to take away, and I don't mean that lightly. It's we've worked before, I've sat here before with, for instance, Missing People next to me, the charity that works really closely with missing children, and they've been fantastic allies over the years. And missing instances, sadly, are a phenomenon that really overlaps heavily with CSE, because so many missing children will be missing from difficult settings, missing from care, will be vulnerable to exploitation. So not to single them out, but there have been good examples of collaborative working in the past. I'm not aware of a recent sort of exercise that we've come together to consider what might be best in that space, but I'm certainly happy to take that away and update you separately.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. Again, one for DAC Southworth. How does the Met ensure that intelligence is shared effectively across partners to identify children at risk of grooming gangs or organised criminal gangs at the earliest opportunity to disrupt perpetrators?
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Roberts. Really important question. Lots of aspects to that. In terms of intelligence sharing, obviously one of our primary partners in this space, as you've heard today, is the National Crime Agency. They've got that national lens, which we don't always have in terms of access to systems. So they can obviously, the funnel through which all online child sex abuse exploitation referrals come through. So obviously sharing our data with them and making sure that we apply their toolkit to what we're dealing with locally is, of course, a key step. We do that routinely, as you would expect. There's also, of course, the support of TOEX, the Organised Exploitation Database, which is housed out of East Anglia, which does an amazing job working with Operation Hydrant. So we have a number of different national partners on this stage who can help us with that national viewpoint. However, at a local level, and I'll skip through this quite promptly for time, if I may, so you probably know some of this already, so I don't want to patronise, my apologies. But then at a local level, of course, we've got the MASH capabilities, as Will rightly says, but you'll be aware also, I'm sure, of the multi-agency child protection teams, which are slowly coming online. This is a real game changer for us, and we're genuinely excited about it. So this is an opportunity for us to bring together our public protection referrals desk, where we've routinely received our concerns around child safeguarding coming into the service, whether they're from partners, public alike. And of course the work of our police conference liaison officers, who are critical members of our workforce, who manage children on child protection plans and so on and so forth, and make sure that strategy meetings are well resourced, etc. That's localised but very, very lucid and necessary multi-agency approach is already good, but I think it'll get much better under the MAC-PTs, the multi-agency child protection teams, once we launch them, because it'll bring together that necessary holistic view of the child in all their facets, because as we know, some children will manifest in many different ways. They might be missing, they might be truanting from an educational setting, they might be on the periphery of a gang, heaven forbid, they might be involved as a victim of child sex abuse. We need to see that child in the whole round and then apply a multi-agency lens so we can problem solve that child out of their situation, especially so when, for instance, they're repeatedly missing from care. And we do see this a lot, and it's really difficult for those children first and foremost, but also for us to try to constantly find them and find them and find them again and keep them safe from harm in situations where the pull factor, pulling them away from the home or away from their care setting, is arguably greater than that which keeps them there. So much that we can't do ourselves in policing necessitates that sharing with partners and charities, as Assemblymember Best rightly says, so we can support those children through a multi-agency approach.
Thank you. And we've heard a lot there about national and local issues. How are you cooperating internationally? Because obviously with so many types of crime, they don't recognise national boundaries these days. So how are you cooperating internationally?
Indeed. Different levels to that, of course. If we're talking about physical trafficking of children and young people, we have a dedicated modern slavery and human trafficking team within Central Specialist Crime who will deal with those, I'll use the expression, more complex cases where we perhaps see children being moved around globally or internationally, and that's obviously a very serious crime in its own right, which demands investigation, whatever purpose it's for, modern slavery, sexual abuse, whatever that might look like. Thankfully, they're not as frequent as other types of CSE, but nevertheless, the capability exists. I think that on a more wide-scale level, the broader threat is that digital one, where we see digital international offending, and that's where our online child sex abuse and exploitation teams work exceptionally closely with international partners to identify children at risk wherever they are in the world. We do see certain parts of the globe where sadly child sex abuse is clearly prevalent and then getting live streamed or otherwise conveyed into people who are, I'll call them end users here in the UK, are actually offenders, making sure that we work closely with big tech, with international forums which monitor for the trafficking of images and streaming of abuse across children, and how we pull that into local policing so that we can literally say, at 123 Acacia Avenue, I hope that address doesn't exist, but at any given
Oh, it
address,
certainly does somewhere.
whoever lives at 123 Acacia Avenue, my apologies, but wherever that address is, that we can say there's somebody working off an IP in that address right now who's accessing the following material, whether live or otherwise, and then ultimately that will have come from a far-flung part of the world. It may involve a child who's being abused somewhere where sadly we may never be able to reach them. But ultimately, we can deal with that offender here today, and wherever we can, we'll reach back into that country to say, you need to be aware of this referral, just in case you can get to this child and safeguard them wherever they are in the world.
Thank you. I'm hoping that at some point we'll come to this in a future meeting, but one of the more high-profile child exploitation rings was the Jeffrey Epstein ring, and we obviously heard a lot about them recently with the release of the files relating to Andrew Mountbatten Windsor. How confident are you that we're able to work or cooperate on an international scale, given that it would appear that there were very big balls dropped during for the Metropolitan Police's investigation of that particular case? They seem to close it down quite quickly, according to the reports in the media.
I see. And you'll forgive me if I may, Assemblymember Roberts, that specific case is very involved. It's not one that I've personally led on.
No.
So I'm afraid I'd have to respond to you out of session on that, because it would be remiss of me to comment on something that I genuinely don't know the detail on. It's been led within our specialist crime team's capability. I have a peer there who's leading on that. So if that's a matter of significant concern, we may be able to give you some information, although... And again, I'm out on a limb slightly when I say this. I believe that's still a live and ongoing investigation. So ultimately, that may be limited in what we can say on that at this point. I hope you'll forgive me. That's not me being evasive. It's just I genuinely don't know.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. We're now going to have an adjournment. We'll come back at 20 to 12. Welcome back to the Police and Crime Committee. We're talking today about grooming gangs. The next questions are on investigating grooming gangs, and we're starting with Assembly Member Hamdash.
Morning, panel. Thank you, Chair. I just want to piggyback a little bit off the back of Assemblymember Roberts' conversations, and you talked really helpfully, Kevin, about children in care. Do you have any observations or thoughts about how we better protect children in care? Because one of the consistent themes in our inquiry has been the vulnerability of children in care.
So I'm really grateful for that question, Assemblymember Hamdash. And yes, children in care in our city is something I think ourselves and Mayor's Office of Policing and Crime and all of our partner agencies really need to focus on in these next years ahead. There are an increasing number of missing instances of children, repeat missing instances, which continue to challenge us both resource-wise, but most importantly in terms of the safeguarding of those children. I think there is a concern, and we need to quantify this before we confirm it, if that makes sense, that perhaps we're seeing a greater number of care homes springing up in certain parts of the city which are not regulated to the degree that we prefer them to be. And that's, I don't think, through anyone's individual fault. I think it's because of the scale of the challenge of getting children into care settings and the resourcing required to do that. So how we work with partners to try to understand how we can make sure there's a safe and friendly environments for children, which will reduce that pull factor that I talked about earlier, that draw them away or cause them to go missing more often. That's obviously something that will be central to our aim, to try to make sure we keep children in safe spaces and away from the contextual safeguarding harms in the extra-familial environment. So there's much to do in that space, and I think we're progressing through it, but there'll still be much more we can do going forward, because we still see instances where we see the same children missing many times who are vulnerable to exploitation, and then we go through an exhaustive effort to safely recover that child back to a place of safety, only for them to go missing again, which isn't good or safe for that child, and it's certainly not helpful from our perspective from a resourcing point of view. And ultimately that resource we'd rather was pointed at any offender who might be abusing them, and that's where we really want to be with that, so we can take out the actual offenders who are causing them harm. So it's a complex question with lots to do in it. And it's something that's very much going to be the focus of our efforts over this next year.
Great, thank you. Now, I would observe a sad phenomenon of a lot of London's children being sent to far-flung locations in seaside towns, far from their community and safety.
Yes.
And of course, then we're talking about the end result in places like this. And it seems that if we can keep children safe in appropriate locations, we can reduce harm.
Yes.
I'd also just want to specifically as well talk briefly about unaccompanied asylum-seeking children, because I think they're a subset of children in care that are sometimes forgotten and are extra vulnerable to exploitation. And quite often when they're going as missing, they're seen as, or whether they're trying to evade the asylum system, or they're finding family that they know. But of course, we know that they're sadly very vulnerable to exploitation in those contexts.
Indeed.
I'll move on. His Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services found that the Met was missing opportunities to pursue lines of enquiry in child criminal and sexual exploitation cases. What changes has the Met made to strengthen these investigations, Kevin?
Thank you again. And forgive me. Apologies, put that on mute. It's always a hazard of having your laptop next to you. My apologies. I thought I'd muted it. So let's just close it instead. Yes, thank you. At risk of slightly repeating what I covered earlier, I think the work we've done in this space we're very proud of. Her Majesty's Inspectorate of Constabulary's report in 2023 was a real call to arms for us, and as the panel rightly indicated, this was actually instigated by the Mayor's Office, but it led us to look closer than we ever have before about how we both grade missing children for risk and about how we understand that risk, and then ultimately make sure we investigate any sexual or criminal exploitation that sits behind it to the best possible degree to safeguard them, bring their offenders to justice. One of the first observations, and this is why I mentioned adultification and victim blaming earlier, is that it particularly applied in this space. So upon review, HMI and others found that quite often the same value judgments that sometimes affected sexual offence investigations were also made of missing children. Excuse my parlance, they'll come back when they're ready. They're streetwise. This happens all the time. That sort of language, that dismissive language, led to us sometimes grading the risk lower than it should have been for children who were repeatedly missing from care, potentially at risk of exploitation. Same paradigm in place, really. The risk was that we failed to see the child as a child at risk in some instances. Not all, I'm pleased to say, but in some instances. And this was found by Her Majesty's Inspectors and kindly flagged to us. So the victim blaming language journey we've been on, where we've tackled those tropes, those myths, those stereotypes about missing children, has been absolutely central. And particularly so when dealing with children from care, or indeed children from various demographics, because the risk was that if you adultify that child, you fail to see them as a child, then of course you fail to see the risk that they're at. Applications of phraseology like streetwise, street smart, etc. abounded, and that's been thankfully largely stamped out now, enabling us to see that risk. We know it's been successful because ultimately the number of children graded high risk went up significantly after the work that we did. So there were significant numbers of children who were being graded as medium risk. And there was a failure to understand in some instances that risk isn't graded purely by risk to loss of life. Because if you look at the risk to loss of life in missing instances, grimly we see more loss of life in adult missing instances than we do in child. And that's so often linked to matters such as suicide and depression, which of course is a whole different and very sensitive area that needs addressing in another forum perhaps. But in terms of children, the more profound risk in that space is actually that the child may appear to be at medium risk, but if they're actually returning home theoretically in one piece, but whilst they've been away, they've been subject to county lines running or sexual abuse, then actually that's not medium risk at all, that's high risk. So reframing our risk grading on the basis of it's not just about risk to life, it's about risk of exploitation and sexual abuse while you're away from the home was absolutely key. And that's been central to our child first training, our re-education of first responders, our recording of missing instances. And that's why the grading of missing children leapt significantly with higher numbers of high-risk children being recorded, so that we could make sure that we address the concerns around them more readily. And every day, including this morning, I checked the Daily Crime Bulletin, there are several on their Daily Crime Bulletin of high-risk missing children at risk or vulnerable of exploitation in some form. That doesn't mean it's actually happening to them, it just means they're at risk of it. But what that tells me as a senior leader in this space is we are now more adept at grading those children as high risk, flagging the risk of exploitation, and with that that qualification comes, of course, the application of resource that goes with it. Because when a child is graded as high risk, we can break open a bigger toolbox of things to recover that child in terms of Investigatory Powers Act capabilities, anything we need to, almost akin to what we'd use in a kidnap or an organised crime operation, whereas we wouldn't routinely do that for a low-risk missing instance. So the grading is important because it affects our response. Our ability to identify the signs and symptoms was key to all of this, and that's why HMI at the end of the review period, at the sort of 18-month phase, came back and complimented us on our ability to stamp out victim blaming, to better recognise those risks and to safeguard children better. I hope that's helpful.
Great, thank you. In one of our earlier inquiries, we heard really importantly how that first contact can shape the victim's confidence in carrying through this case to its full end. I'd be keen to know how most commonly do victim survivors come forward? Is it when a missing person is found? Are people coming to front desks? Is it online reporting? Do you have a sense of what the most common modality is for when you first meet a victim?
Are we talking about sexual exploitation now or missing?
Yeah, so more broadly perhaps.
More broadly. I'm afraid the answer to that is probably what you'd expect, which is it is all of the above. It is a variety of all of those. We will get partner referrals in from, sorry, waving at you, Will, but the partner referrals through social services. Will was a former director of children's services, so he knows whereof I speak. But yes, we will get partner referrals in about child safeguarding, which might come through third parties or others. We will get direct reporting, and we'll have concerned relatives or friends. The referrals in through NGOs, as Assemblymember Best alluded to earlier, and we can perhaps do more with that. So there's lots of different routes by which children come to our attention and through and into our multi-agency safeguarding hubs, which can then be reviewed at our multi-agency child exploitation review panels. There's lots of different methods and mechanisms via which children can come to notice. I think one of the benefits of the MAC PTs when we pull them onto line is the idea is to try and bring all this into one space. It becomes entirely more coherent in our structure, so we can really streamline that and make sure we minimise the touch points for the child. So it's a very involved area, but I hope that gives some lucidity to it.
It's helpful, and it's helpful to know that you want to minimise touch points. I've been in touch with public access officers who are working at front desks, and they've made me aware of proposed changes where victims of sexual violence and domestic violence will be asked to bring up their cases with PAOs instead of what is currently constables and inspectors. Now, PAOs are raising with me their concern that they're not trained to handle these cases, and actually what might end up happening is a victim has to report to them and then report again to a constable, which is not easy. So I wondered whether you're confident that these changes to PAOs might not limit our ability to support victims and survivors sensitively and thoroughly.
It's really useful feedback, thank you. And if you have an identified colleague you can signpost me to, I'd be more than happy to engage with them and find out what training they have actually had. Most of our PAOs will have had training in this regard. And in fairness, we had some really good success stories in that space. So forgive me, I know we're not here for individual anecdotes, but an example in question was at one particular BCU, a public access officer was working studiously at the front desk with a whole queue of people waiting to see them. And there was a lady sat quietly at the back who patiently, bless her, waited in the queue until she got to the front, probably behind people reporting lost property and so on and so forth, only to announce when she got there that she'd been a victim of quite serious domestic abuse. That particular public access officer kindly took the time out to sit down with them, as you'd expect, take a really sort of trauma-informed and patient approach to them to elicit not just what had happened, but the wider, deeper concerns that this domestic abuse actually manifested. It transpired that particular lady had been subject to a series of domestic rapes over an extended period, which, thanks to the trust and confidence that was built, she confided in my colleague. And as a consequence, before that lady even left the police station that day, officers had gone round, arrested her husband, and he was later charged with domestic rape and a series of domestic abuse offences. So I'm highly supportive of and confident in our PAOs in the work that they do. There may be individual instances where there's concerns that, am I up to this job? Because it is actually really demanding when you've got such a variety of footfall through your public access office. I don't think we should underestimate it. Years ago, as constables, we used to do that and still do sometimes. I covered the station desk myself, and it was remarkable the things that would walk through the door in their variety. So it's a demanding job. We're very proud of what they do. If there's individual colleagues who don't feel they've had the training, we can help them. But there isn't anything in there that should materially affect our efforts here, because ultimately, as that case shows, when it's done right and done well, we can really help victim survivors in the way we'd like to.
I mean, there's no doubt that there's not PAOs who are doing wonderful work. I think the concern that's being raised is how busy PAOs are. Front desks are, from what I hear, are increasingly busy. The concern of a victim having to wait a long time to speak to a PAO, particularly when, PAOs are handling a range of cases from sex offenders signing on to bail conditions. And the other concern is about people having to report twice. So once to a PAO and then again to a constable. Well, currently they might not have to do that twice. So I think I would really urge us to look at those changes and to see whether they're handling survivors the best possible. So I'll move on to my other question. So what specific steps have you taken to ensure the Met has improved its investigative and safeguarding approach to CSE, including grooming gangs? And Kaya, if you're happy to take this one.
So, sorry, Benali, your question was about what oversight we've had on the improvement?
Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you. It's really, first of all, as I mentioned, it was the Mayor's concern that brought in HMI in the first place in 2023. We've, alongside the Met, fully accepted the recommendations, and MOPAC sits on the delivery board for those recommendations. We have also obviously worked alongside the Metropolitan Police Service to work on the child strategy, moreover, taking a child-first approach, seeing safeguarding as a primary priority in that. And that is a constant area of oversight and review for us, both through the relevant boards internally in the Met, but also on the work schedule of the London Policing Board, so there's public scrutiny of that as well. I think that's the main areas, but Will, is there anything else I've not covered?
No, I think that's really, really solid. I mean, we also have a range of meetings below that where, Guy mentioned, we're on these boards. I personally, on the Mayor's behalf, can hold Kevin to account for some of this stuff. I think, though, it's that children's strategy, and it's the push from the Mayor and Deputy Mayor to go beyond child-centred policing, but to go to child first. Kevin's been a big champion in this, but the Met is the first place in the country, the first force that is taking a child-first approach. That's huge. And all of the things that Kevin, I think, described earlier came from that. And that's something the Mayor and Deputy Mayor and their bilats pushed really hard for, and right up into the right to the end, which I think is incredible.
Can I just add, on the back of the work we've done in that area, and goes to the conversation we were having previously about the vulnerability of children looked after, We have also worked across the London Partnership to create a strategy of reducing criminality of looked after children, recognising the additional risk that they are under, and we're working across the multi-agency to make sure that we are reducing that risk because we're so aware of that highlighted risk. I very much share the concern around missing children. I think being a corporate parent is a real honour, and I think that you should approach that with the same love that you have for your own children. That's always been my thing, and if you don't know where your children are, that would bring huge anxiety to me. So I think that should be embedded in the approach, and we continue to work across the Safeguarding Executive to push that and hear the Met's concerns in that area.
Okay.
Thank you. It's definitely a responsibility there with corporate parentage that sits heavily with me as a local councillor. I think it's one we need to think really thoughtfully about. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Colleagues, we're running exceptionally behind time. Can you keep questions and answers as brief as possible? Can we make sure we just stick on the whole grooming gang issues? I know it's very easy to lapse into other things, but we're here for the report on grooming gangs. Lord Duval.
Thank you very much. I've got 3 points, and they're a bit disjointed, but they've all come up from your answers to previous questions. Somewhere in this, where does the youth offending team? I know it's about criminals that may have been victims in the process and information. It was about something you said, DAC, around routes of information. How do we gain information and disclosure? And that whole process, now you in MOPAC oversee, you might not have the authority, but you oversee the youth justice system here. It is the tripartite agency. I know it's not truly driven by the police, but where does the youth offending teams fit into this? Shall I give you all my 3 questions and then you can work out that, because there's some answers there. Look, and to get over the issue of people on trust and confidence, why are we not investing more clearly about those that can use third parties to help support the police? So if the victim won't speak to the police because they have real problems, but a third party could, if they've got the confidence of the victim, engage with the police to see if there's any issues around that. Why are we not investing in a system of that? And that would overcome some of the issues that members have had around that, because I believe that we should be walking the extra mile in these cases. And if there are people out there that have offended in the past or continuing to offend, how do we get there? And we explore every opportunity. And then really it goes back into police management. And again, something you said earlier on about inquisitive policing around management practice and best practice. Now, I want to be a bit blunt about this, but you know, it's great when you come before us and tell us this is the line from senior management, and somehow as we go down in the rest of the organisation when they're dealing with their different pressures that they face, it gets lost. So what's the sampling arrangements that we're testing, that what you're saying, that this new regime is being maintained London-wide, and that we're getting the consistency of the approach that we want, and what's new? Because that should be one of the key lessons in the Met. Time and time again, I'm always back here. And then just very quickly, one of the last points I want to say about the missing person piece. I was involved in the Baby P issue, and there was a lot of multi-agency failings, but the police failing in that was the missing person piece. If we had managed to get to the missing person piece and followed up where there was exploitation going on, we might have stopped a murder of a child in another sexual abuse case. So I'm always thinking about these connections whenever this comes up around that and why. But the Met, again, has always known there was a weakness in the missing person bit. So I'm very pleased to hear what I've heard this morning. It sounds like a different approach. But again, how do we sustain that? How do we make sure we get that? I think you referred to it, 85 up to 99, because we'll never be 100%.
Shall I lead off, colleagues, if you're happy for me to? Did you want to?
If we could have brief answers, I'd be grateful. We're so far behind.
Lord Deval, if I, on the Youth Justice Board, completely agree. Youth Justice Board sit on our wider London Justice Board that we have and feed in. We've had individual sessions on children, but I also say that we've also had sessions on CSE and sexual abuse. Moreover, because we know obviously that there's a wider criminal justice approach that's needed in the police and crime plan, we've said we need to drive improvement in that system with a victims approach, and that goes obviously for the victims of sexual violence. We know that a lot of reports of sexual abuse which happened in childhood don't get reported into adulthood. So we need to make sure across the criminal justice system we're aware of that, and we've had sessions to make sure, especially on the back of Operation Beaconport, that we are all on the same page on that in terms of making sure the system is geared up for that operation in particular. In terms of third parties can report on behalf of victim survivors. We see that both in statutory partners and our commission services, and it's really important. We know from the work that the previous independent victim commissioner did that the support that they have alongside this really enables them to sustain their willingness to stay within the criminal justice system, which we know is a challenge. I'd like to also particularly highlight the work of the Lighthouse and our 4 child sexual abuse hubs in this space, who actually work actively alongside police to make sure that interviews happen with a child-first, trauma-informed approach, and that court appearances can be recorded and enabled via video link.
Thank you. Mindful of time, if I can perhaps add some points on each, Lord Deval. So yes, the YOTS team, really vital, integral part of this. Part of the child first approach, as you know, is that we make sure we use the child gravity matrix. So when we're assessing the risk posed by children, or the risk they may be posed to them, we take this in the rounds before we inadvertently criminalise children who may in fact be at risk themselves. And that's a really important part of that whole child first approach, avoiding the unnecessary criminalisation of children who may be at risk simply because they've appeared in this iteration as an offender. We do dip sampling of that, to your point about how does it work out further down the chain. So if we see, for instance, a possession with intent to supply against a 14-year-old found in possession of cocaine, once upon a time, pardon my expression, that would have just gone straight through as an easy charge. Probably ended up in a caution perhaps for a first offence. But inadvertently we've then set that child off down a route where they've now got a criminal record, forever juvenile granted, but nevertheless, what does that then lead to? And it cleaves to Lord Lammy's report, doesn't it, about the inadvertent criminalisation of a whole generation of young people from certain communities. So really important strategic stuff there. How we weigh up the risk both from and to children in a way that protects society from any harm, but individually protects them as well, is a really important part where YOTS play their piece and then play into the MACPT's work with the CGM and others. I'm moving quickly just for speed. You mentioned as well about third parties being able to support. An example of that, the Central Specialist Crime Team I mentioned earlier, who deal with really complex group-based CSE cases, do actually use a really successful system called Victim Navigators, where we get expert third parties in who can help victims who may not even know perhaps just how deep in thrall they are to their exploiters, to navigate that really difficult journey of an investigation and prosecution. So that's a really good pioneering model. It's not at scale yet, but it's an example of somewhere, perhaps to Assembly members' best point, that we can work better with third parties and NGOs to support children through this journey. Your point about professional curiosity and how things are cascaded down, so the good strategic stuff that we say here doesn't just get lost in the ether on the way. I will say that one of our key safeguards in that was our dedicated inspection team, complemented exceptionally highly by Her Majesty's Inspectorate, almost like a mini HMI within, that would go around and routinely check these different concerning crime types that we're talking about today and safeguarding phenomenon. So they would do a thematic on missing children and dip sample 100 cases, make sure there's no victim blame and make sure grading's right, etc., etc. They'd then do one on rape investigate, make sure that victim experience is what it should be and that opportunities are taken, and then work their way around. That team has had to be significantly reduced as part of the reductions that the Chair alluded to before, and is now much smaller than it once was. So don't let me beguile the Assembly members here today into thinking that all is as good as I would like it to be. If this were fully resourced to the degree that we would like it to be, I could strap up that team a lot more and make it far stronger to do the dip sampling to make sure. Because otherwise, I'm, to a degree, in the hands of what I'm told by my senior leaders, and I don't like to be there. I'd rather be dip sampling behind it and then holding people to account. But of course, we need every single frontline officer and investigative capability pointed at direct crimes here today because of the scale of what we've talked about here. So my opportunities to do the housekeeping around that, the safeguarding of our quality, is something that I'm concerned about. And I agree with you on that. I think that we need to do more of it. But it's hard to do that if we need everybody, all hands to the pumps on the front line. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. DAC Southwark, and my apologies for previously demoting you. I think you've had a promotion since you were last here. Apologies and congratulations.
Kevin is fine, honestly. Thank you.
Just before I ask my question, can I just take a second to just really emphasise the work of the Child First strategy, which I know that you have led on personally, and I'm really pleased that some of the issues that we've raised in this committee around issues such as adultification were taken on board and, you know, have been part of that fantastic strategy. And I do hope that that is something that will be emulated across the country with police services, because it really is an excellent piece of work and a policy and strategy. My question is about historic cases of group-based child sexual exploitation. So the Deputy Mayor spoke about how difficult it is sometimes for victims of historic cases to come forward. But sometimes, you know, they do, and we know that they do, and we've seen that more and more. There are clearly challenges that the Met faces when investigating those new reports of, you know, events that took place many years ago and have left people with the, you know, almost unimaginable trauma. Can you tell us what steps is the Met taking to overcome this?
Thank you for the question and for the commentary on the children's strategy, which is very much dear to us all, as you know. In terms of those non-recent offences and those who come forward, again, to Assemblymember Westpoint, this is where sometimes third-party NGOs have a really key role to play. You'll be aware of NAPAC, which is the National Association for People Abused in Childhood, which is for adult victim survivors who haven't yet reported but come forward. So we can work with partners like that to try to make sure we get the right trauma-informed approach for those who've maybe sat on their suffering for a vast period of time before finally finding the courage and confidence to come forward and report to us. Where that happens, of course, then we apply the soteria lens, if I can call it that, to such offences to make sure that we put the investigative focus onto the suspect in that case. And it's never too late. Of course, justice for anyone can never come too late from our point of view, and then follow through as best we can. Other than that, to be fair, it follows through the conventional mechanisms you would expect. So we might not necessarily need to engage a sexual offences interview techniques officer or SOIT because it's so non-recent. So there may not be, clearly in that instance, any reason to go to a haven, for instance, or something, because of course if it's very non-recent, that won't be the case. But eliciting the full story from the victim survivor, however late in life, to then look back and think, how can we provide justice for them, is somewhere we need to work with partners on and just do our best. I think that's probably all I can say on that one.
Thank you. And also, again, Operation Bluestone Soteria, as it originally was, yet another excellent Met initiative, which I believe is actually being taken up across the board and across the country. So congratulations on that one.
Thank you.
Thank you. We're moving now on to supporting victims, survivors and trust and confidence. We've touched a little bit on this, but starting off is Assemblymember Wilson.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. One of the comments that I think really stuck with me from the previous meeting was when Dr. Junior Smart told us that many young people do not have faith in the systems around them and are more fearful of the risks that are going to happen from them stepping forward than they are about any form of justice being done. I think that kind of encapsulates a real kind of balance there of you know, sort of what might happen to them, the risk of, you know, further repercussions and further abuse, further, you know, horrific treatment, compared to the actual likelihood of the perpetrators being investigated, arrested, charged, ultimately convicted and you know, incarcerated. So that kind of balance, is that something you still recognise as being a very valid concern now? And also, as a kind of counter to that, and hopefully improvement to that, we've heard reference being made to this children's strategy and child first approach. Could you perhaps, Kevin, explain in a little bit more detail what that actually means in practice and how that is hopefully improving the way this whole situation can be balanced?
Certainly, and thank you again. We've been lucky enough to work with Dr. Smart Jr., as I know him, for many years now, and on a range of different issues, and his insight is absolutely invaluable, so always grateful for his contributions to this, and he's led the way in so many ways. I think some of the context of that will be useful, though, because it may be referring to that in a gang context. So I worked with Junior when I was head of Trident about our interventions around gangs. And, of course, there is a valid risk there. Ultimately, if you have a child who's trapped in a gang situation, the risk of them coming forward to report a crime or a safeguarding matter to us may leave them thinking, well, what's going to happen to me? This is where our child gravity matrix approach through our youth offending team and the more considered child first approach we're taking across our investigations really comes in, because the last thing we want if that young person comes forward is for them to, all they get out of it is a charge for possession with intent to supply or something similar because they've come forward and it's clear they're involved in drug supply. The right look at this is, well, hang on a minute, why is this 14-year-old, where is he getting his cocaine that he's selling on the street corner? Because, in fact, he won't be providing it and he certainly won't be manufacturing it. It's being provided to him and he's probably enthralled to someone. Now, past the point, we must be careful we don't give licence to every child to commit offences. We need to weigh up carefully, of course, at what point someone is old enough and capable enough to make a conscious choice to committing criminality beyond a certain point. But if we come from a start point, a bit like rape investigation, we come from a start point where we're prepared to take that child first look, which is where it cleaves to the strategy and what that actually means in real terms. As you know, the ABCD of child first is treat as a child, build pro-social identity, collaborate and destigmatise. That's roughly it. So treating as a child first means exactly that. Why is this child a young person before me? Let's not inadvertently criminalise them. Let's be willing to see the risk behind the individual. Within that, then, there's the suspect focus approach, which we should be taking in all our crimes to make sure we go after, excuse the expression, those who may be causing them harm and then safeguard them. Limitations in this space, we've touched on some of them today. How many secure and safe placements do we have for children who come forward so that if they do take that brave step, can we house them safely in an environment from which they're not going to be at further risk? Does that need to be in the locale of where they are? Someone raised before about distance. Sometimes distance can be a good or bad thing. It might be a good thing in some instances that a child is home some difference away from where they have originally been abused. But again, a complex question. I hope I've covered both points there, but child first really does mean that, and that's how we'll make sure that we always take a considered approach, identify the risk, and target those who are really responsible for any offending. Is that helpful?
Thank you.
Thank you. Assembly Member Best.
Thank you. Just coming on to yourself, Will, to speak about the MOPAC Commission Victim Support Services. Did you want to tell us about any of those, firstly, and perhaps how they're improving confidence in reporting and engagement with investigations?
Yeah, thank you. So the first thing I'd say is I might talk about a few different services, but just really important for London, it doesn't matter where you go. So any victim service will get you to the right place because we have a sort of ecosystem. So don't feel you have to advise people to go to these specific services. The London Victim Witness Service will get you to the right place. So for children and young people specifically, and for those who've been victims of child sexual exploitation, Deputy Mayor's mentioned already the Mayor's long-standing commitment in the Lighthouse. So the Lighthouse is our centre of expertise of the system. So that's where you can actually go through an entire criminal justice process without ever stepping foot in a court or, in fact, ever talking to a police officer, which is kind of incredible and kind of how it should be. I'm really pleased that national model, which we've pioneered in London, is going to be rolled out nationally now so that, you know, we know that there aren't just victims of CSE in London, they're victims of CSE all over the country. They'll be able to access that too. However, there are also hubs, so CSE hubs that we commission with the NHS ICBs, as they're called in those regions. So those work with the Lighthouse so that we're spreading the expertise. The important thing here is, when you think specifically about victim survivor confidence, is you do not need to be in a criminal justice process. You don't need to have reported the crime. You know, you just need to know where to go. And once you're there, we can talk about, first of all, make sure that you're coping and recovering from your victimisation. That's the most important thing. then we can support a criminal justice outcome. But going back to the previous Assembly member's point, that's where those colleagues can help you report, and as the Deputy Mayor said, you need never step in. I'm really pleased that when Beacon Port came out, the Mayor has made additional funding available, so we'll be able to increase the capacity of those services by 20%, which I think is really positive. Lots of victims who may be re-traumatised by knowing that these investigations are going on, or later might be contacted, will now be adults. And in the adult system, again, it's really important that this is independent of the criminal justice system. So if you are nervous about talking to the police, if you're nervous about the system that you're going to go into, again, the most important starting point is this is where you will get support to be able to cope and recover from the victimisation that you've experienced, and then we'll talk about criminal justice system. So again, there's a really good network which has been completely designed around victim survivors. I would also point out to another Assembly member's question, it doesn't matter if these aren't just for, no matter how you identify your gender, there is support for you, no matter what the nature of that sexual violence was, there is specialist support available to you. And again, really proud to say the Mayor has invested more in this year, and will be able to increase the capacity for the same reasons. So just to say again, even if you're coming forward much later than if years have passed since your offence has happened, that doesn't mean you're not eligible for support, and it doesn't mean that later on the police won't investigate if that's what you want. But I just encourage anybody you come in contact to, anyone who contacts you as a result of the work that I know you all do, to please encourage people to go to these services and get help and support. Thank you.
Thank you. And just wanted to check on the Lighthouse project. Obviously, that was pioneered back in 2018 with the previous government, who gave substantial funding to make sure that project worked. Is that something that you've seen from the current government? Because obviously there's been talk of new facilities. Is that something that's progressing?
Yes, and I visited the current lighthouse with the then Health Secretary to look at the model, and the then Violence Against Women and Girls Minister to look at the model, show how it works, and have followed up with letters about how we could expand that in London as they look to expand it across the country.
So are you confident that we're going to get the funding to open a similar facility? I think places like Notting Hill have been touted before.
We're working closely with government to understand how they're going to do the rollout. We have spoken to the current leadership of the Lighthouse about how they think it should work in a hub and spoke model, and we agree with their expertise linking in with the health services around London.
So you're confident the government will support you in that and give you the funding?
I'm obviously conscious that the government at the moment is going through some change and churn, but we have on record our full support for the rollout. We know how important it is. We know, obviously, based on the conversation we're having today, that we need to continue to prioritise children and children who've been sadly the victims of sexual abuse. So we will continue to push this model because we know it works and we want to see it expanded.
So do you know when you might get some more clarity as to whether the new incoming government will support the programme and look to increase access in London?
We've been told September.
September. Okay, great. Thank you. And Will, obviously, I've asked you previously about the support for the cyber helpline, which obviously was another programme that this government meant that we had to scrap because they reduced the grant to us here. Has that been something that you've looked at commissioning again, or is there a similar operation that you've looked to commission those services from?
So, I mean, just to reassure, the cyber helpline still very much exists.
Not with the support of the London grant, though.
Absolutely. So there was some London specificity.
So just to be absolutely clear, because that was misleading, is the cyber helpline exists as a service. What they were providing was a London-centric offer, which was supporting police officers in London, victims across London, to get a very specialised support service from London, and that has been scrapped.
Sure, but I suppose I didn't want to mislead anyone listening who might want to call the cyber helpline for help and support that they couldn't, because the service sort of still exists. In terms of what we were talking about earlier about tech-enabled VORG, the Mayor has announced some additional funding for that. I'm working very closely to try and put some proposals. The Deputy Mayor's given me a really strong steer about what she would like and what the Mayor would like in supporting victims. We've also engaged with many of them. So at a later date, there will be additional support and services for those victims in London who have had a tech aspect to their victimisation, which I think is fantastic.
So you can confirm that there will be funding going in to replace the services we lost in London, and that will be something that addresses the grooming that's happened online.
So I think there's probably three different things here. There's the cyber helpline and the elements of that which were London specific. That was quite a broad service for anybody who'd experienced any victimisation sort of with a cyber aspect. The second thing I think that I was describing was the Mayor's new investment in victim services for those who've experienced tech-enabled violence against women and girls.
So will that include, so the previous service would have covered those that have been subject to grooming online. I'm just asking, with the new services, will that cover victims that have had an aspect of grooming online in their case?
So I don't want to get too much into the service model because the Deputy Mayor hasn't approved it yet.
Do you think it's important that the new service has a function to support victims that have had online grooming as part of their case?
So the Deputy Mayor.
I would, Assembly Member Best, my short answer would be yes. But what I would also say is we want to work alongside other partners in this. We already fund the Violent Exploitation Support Service, especially working with young people who have real expertise. They're a consortium in exploitation and grooming. We understand that grooming online is a significant issue that can lead, sadly, to real-life abuse as well as the coercion and control online. So that is definitely an aspect that we will look to address in the new services. But we haven't. I think Will's hesitation is because that service hasn't been fully designed. But I'm happy to come back to the committee to talk more about it.
Yeah, I just want to know that you think it's important as part of that.
Okay, thank you. Assembly Member Ahmed.
Thank you, Chair. Will, can you just take us through the process of when and what support is available to a child or a young person who has been sexually exploited from the point they first come into contact with services through to after any criminal process? Tell us the routes, please.
Can I ask for it to be as brief as possible? We've only got half an hour left. And
Sure. Well, I think we're a lot closer with children and young people to the kind of model we'd actually like for adults, which is for the child and young person, they should have the same support throughout. So the place they go immediately after reporting the incident has happened should be the people they talk to all through, and they shouldn't see the joins. And that's what the Lighthouse model kind of tells us to do. So hopefully it should be as simple as that. Now, what I would say is that there are other pathways into this. So we know that children and young people can make disclosures at any point. And they can make disclosures to their social workers, to their youth workers. So what's really important, and that's why I think the Deputy Mayor and my police colleague have spoken so much about the safeguarding system, because people will have different journeys and people will disclose in different ways. What we're all joined up to try and do is to make sure that you have that continuity of support. You have that one person who's going to be with you on this journey. So that's what we used to talk about a team around the child, a lead professional model, and so that's really important. Sorry, I tried to be brief. It's a very complex thing.
Thank you. And there is something that you touched on there that is actually really important, and I certainly want some reassurance about this. So in the NHS, if a literally the moment a child reaches their 18th birthday, they go out of children and young people services into adult services, and there is an absolute disjoin there. Too often things go horribly wrong, and it doesn't work. We know that it doesn't work. With the services that you're describing, does that happen at all? I mean, is a young person on their 18th birthday immediately referred to adult services, or will the care that they have received as a child from that one organisation follow them through?
Yeah, they absolutely can. I mean, I know I used the word, which I know not everyone likes, so the idea of an ecosystem earlier. But I suppose what that means is we've got lots of specialist providers. What we want them to do is to be able to work together to do exactly the thing that you said, so that we don't have these arbitrary and artificial boundaries in place. And many of our particularly our ISVAs, our independent sexual violence advocates, are experienced at working with both children and adults. We have some that are just specialists that will just work with children. So there are a range of ways that we can make sure there's this continuity, but we don't. I think victim services, being slightly independent of the statutory systems, don't have to follow those really rigid rules that I appreciate is more challenging for my NHS colleagues.
If I might add, Assembly Member Ahmed, that's part of the reason we have now set up the Sexual Violence Alliance, which is an alliance of a consortium of the most significant providers in this space. So we have a follow-through and a kind of overview of this system of support, and they can all feed in from the many aspects in which they support victims of sexual violence to make sure that we have that system-wide oversight.
Right, that's very reassuring. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Right, we're coming on to another section, and that's support through the criminal justice process, and that starts with Assembly Member Hamdash.
Great, thank you. So, to the Deputy Mayor, the committee has heard evidence that specialist voluntary sector organisations play a vital role in supporting victim survivors, but that short-term funding can make it difficult to provide consistent long-term support. How does MOPAC ensure its commissioning arrangements ensure specialist support is available and sustainable?
So, yes, we really recognise the challenge for the voluntary sector in that kind of cycle of grant applications. It's something that we've worked really closely with the voluntary sector on to understand the barriers to applications and challenges to applying. Will leads on that commissioning work, so I don't know if you want to speak more to that.
Absolutely. So this is a common thing that voluntary sector organisations experience. MOPAC's commissioning standard is always to commission for as long as we possibly can. So in terms of services that we're commissioning, those will be normally a minimum of 3 years to give exactly that certainty, particularly for things like ISVAs. There isn't a huge workforce out there. We want organisations to be able to train more, and we want those people who are coming into those professions to have that certainty. Where we're giving grants to maybe smaller organisations, we used to have something called a small grant scheme. We have one which is in the violence against women and girls space. That may be shorter, and the reason for that is we want those organisations, to be able to grow, and we want them to use that grant funding, but not become reliant on it. So there is probably a differentiation there.
But just to add on that fund, we see as part of our role, not only as funder, but capacity builders as well. So we don't just hand out a grant for a short amount of time and then say, because you're small, sink or swim. I really want to be clear. We actively support those organisations in terms of capacity building and support for access to other funds.
Thank you. You mentioned ISVAs, Will. At our last meeting, Professor Beckett brought up the value of children getting a dedicated CHISVA, so a children independent sexual violence advocate. Is that common in London that CHISVAs would be available? Do we need to look at funding to make sure that they're more widely available? That was certainly an observation from the last panel.
I think we have CHISVAs as part of our mix. I think we have a slightly different model here in London with the Lighthouse. So there's a much stronger focus on emotional support. and a much stronger kind of almost, more, I don't want to use the word clinical because it doesn't sound quite right, but so you may not always need, our model might not need CHSVAs in the same volume as others might. But I'm not saying CHSVAs aren't valuable. They really are. I just sort of think that the support offer in London is probably a bit more comprehensive than one individual CHSVA could provide, whereas in other parts of the country where their mayors haven't made this kind of investment, they're much more reliant on a single professional.
Well, I just add that perhaps as an outcome from this, it'd be great to talk to Professor Beckett about her experience across this country and whether there's anything that we can learn to improve our London provision, because she is leading a campaign about more dedicated CHSVAs. It'd be great if we've already got it covered, but if there's anything that we can learn from her work, that would be brilliant. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Assembly Member Small Edwards.
Thank you, Chair. My question is to Will and to the Deputy Mayor. The Mayor announced a £2.4 million package of support and advocacy for victims and survivors of child sexual exploitation in November 2025. How has this funding been allocated, and how will MOPAC assess whether it has improved outcomes for victims and survivors in London?
Assembly Member Small Edwards, I believe you're talking about the additional money that the Mayor announced to support the victims and survivors that might come forward on the back of Operation Beacon Port. We're using that money to extend our expertise in this area. So as previously mentioned, we have the Lighthouse and we have our 4 child sexual abuse hubs. So we're using that money to make sure there's more capacity within their system given their expertise. We know that as we've previously said, obviously the Lighthouse has been recognised as best practice nationally, so we're confident in their ability to support victims. I also understand that obviously, as previously mentioned, some of these will be adults, and we are working across our sexual violence system to make sure they get that support, especially in the Mayor's funding of the sexual violence advocates. So this is making sure that victims of sexual violence have access to legal support through professional solicitors to make sure that they can navigate the criminal justice system with the highest level of expertise. This is another great example of MOPAC's pilots that is now leading to being rolled out nationally, but we've put in some additional funding to support as part of the support we want to offer victims of survivors that may come forward as Operation Beacon Port goes forward.
Thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. And in my conversation with DAC Southworth earlier, we spoke about what's changed kind of since 2022. So from MOPAC's perspective, where have you seen the clearest improvements in how victims are treated, and how are you making sure those improvements are consistent across all boroughs rather than dependent on which officer a child happens to meet?
Thank you. I think this is a key part of our oversight. We really support the work, obviously, that has been done by HMI to raise the recommendations they have around child sexual abuse. Obviously, DAC Southwest has outlined some of that in terms of victim blaming language, missing incidents, our willingness to take a curious, trauma-informed approach to all children, and the Child First strategy, which has come on the back of the work that we've done with them. Operation Soteria is another area that MOPAC has worked closely with the Metropolitan Police Service and has supported the national rollout of that. And Robin Merritt from MOPAC still is involved in that work as national leaders. I think it's really important that we are never complacent in this area. So our oversight will continue to be prioritised in this area. As I mentioned, that's both internally through myself and the Mayor's Bilats, our deep dive work. We had a deep dive session earlier this week on this issue, and my deep dive session on the victims support more widely that we want to see. And we're working to support the Met to develop a victim strategy, which obviously will align with the Children's First strategy as well. So this is an area we continue to push in terms of MOPAC's oversight, and we have as a standing item on the London Policing Board, because we obviously want all of the victims and all children, moreover, to make sure they have the highest prioritisation in terms of safety.
Deputy Mayor, thank you very much. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Can I quickly ask you, the Mayor allocated a further 29 million of funding to tackle violence against women and girls in the February budget. What proportion of that funding, if any, of course, is being allocated to services for survivors of grooming gangs and exploitation?
So you'll know that the money allocated, the 29 million, was on top of the I think it's circa 176 million that the Mayor already invests in violence against women and girls services. And that encompasses some of the services we've already mentioned today. The Mayor has invested the additional 29 million so that we can keep some of those great services going, including some of the grassroots fund work that we do for organisations in London that have by and for expertise. So this is really important because obviously, as said previously, we know London's demographics are varied, and we want to make sure we're supporting that. We have also taken forward the work in the 29 million to look at public spaces. This is a piece of work we're doing across the GLA to make sure that we're working with planning colleagues and local authorities to make sure that the physicality of London is informed by victim survivors' experiences, and that's really important in terms of the prevention of harm, which obviously fits into this space as well, because children, we want to be in our streets as well. And then additionally, the tech-enabled work that we've talked about in this committee, and finally, the work that we're doing to support victim and survivors back into employment to reduce the re-victimisation given the economic issues in this. I would say that that equally could touch children in this space, because we've talked about the victim survivors experience in terms of exploitation. Yep. We know through the work we've been doing in Camden on...
OK, well, I tell you what, that does sound interesting, and we've got a whole month without committee meetings, so I'd love to look at that. So do you have a definitive programme or a provider list for all these commissioned services you're able to share with the committee?
Yes.
Oh, could you send that then? I'd be really interested to see that.
Is that on our current list or these new areas?
Well, all of it. I'd be so interested to see. So, one of my issues is that police are so short of money. They need money for frontline officers. So I'd be very interested to see where these millions and millions are going elsewhere, to see how they assist the police or not. And I've got the time to look at it. So if you could get those lists sent, that would, of all these different places that you commission, that would be so helpful.
Yeah, we can definitely provide that list. I think alongside my colleagues in the Violence Reduction Unit, we're very clear, and I think the police feel the same, that the support service that we commission is vital. We know a lot of victim survivors might never want a criminal justice outcome, but still need the support.
I do understand. I do. But we are looking at millions and millions, and we're looking at a police service that is short of millions and millions. So it's getting the balance right, really, isn't it? So I'd be really, really grateful if I could be sent that list before the end of this month, so I can spend August
to see that, Chair.
Sadly looking at that as opposed to going away. But that would be interesting to me. Thank you. So we're coming on to the last section now, which is partnership working and trauma-informed approaches. So I'm a massive supporter of multi-agency working. I think it's the best thing that we do. So how effectively are multi-agency child exploitation, or we call them MACE meetings, operating across London to identify and support children at risk of grooming gangs, and what improvements are needed? Shall I start with you, Kevin?
Thank you, Chair. I think consistency would be our aiming point in this. There are well-established multi-agency child exploitation meetings in each BCU. I think, as a point of reflection for us, they do slightly differ in their makeup and how many cases they can hear, depending on which BCU you're in. And to our Assembly member's point before, we definitely don't want to be in a postcode lottery where you get a differing service depending on where you're based. So I think the next step for us in MACE development is to make sure we have that consistent application of the principles everywhere, because we know that multi-agency approach to victims in this space is absolutely essential. In the spirit of keeping my answer short, that's probably the best next step, I think.
Yeah, it's always important in every area of policing, in my view. Do either of you have anything else to?
I was just going to agree with that. So we mentioned earlier that MOPAC funds the London Safeguarding Executive, and there's a subgroup of that called the Adolescent Safeguarding Board, which looks particularly, and it's been doing a lot of work with Kevin and ourselves on new MACE protocols. Something's coming which I think is really good, a new London MACE protocol for harm outside the home. So I think that speaks directly to some of the things that we're talking about today. And as Kevin says, that's going to give us much more consistency and effectiveness across London. You know, these are the responsibilities of the individual boroughs, but this is where I think having a London approach that can look at consistency is just going to make sure, as colleagues have said, that victims get a consistent service across London.
Yeah, and how are you making sure that the actual survivors have, you know, their voices are heard in the decision making? How do you ensure that?
In a MACE meeting.
Yeah,
so,
but how are their thoughts put into those meetings?
Yeah, so all meetings about a child require the voice of that child in them.
Yeah.
Be they MACE meetings, be they, you know, things in youth justice world. That's pretty common standard across London. So, you know, if you're the subject of a MACE meeting, you will have a professional who is your lead professional. They will be capturing your views and they will be playing them into the meeting. That is whatever your vulnerability is in London, whatever panel you're at, and that's been that way for a few years, which is great.
Okay. I'm pleased to hear that. Thank you. Assembly Member Roberts.
Thank you, Chair. DAC Southworth, how does the Met ensure that its training is trauma-informed, victim-centred, informed by lived experience, and free from victim-blaming language, and importantly addresses the specific harms associated with group-based child sexual exploitation?
Thank you. If you take the Child First training, which we baked into the New Met for London training, an entire day was comprised where we made sure that in addition to formulating this in conjunction with groups of young children, particularly those from diverse backgrounds, we informed directly their feedback about what they wanted from their policing service and touch points into that training, whilst at the same time we made sure we had genuine academics from the field who understand these issues better than we do as police to help us devise the training and sometimes bring some of those more controversial points forward that really challenge the delegates to make sure that those benefiting from this training really don't just get it from that classic sort of police training lens. There is a bit of a trope about a police officer with a PowerPoint trying to train other police officers, and I'm pleased to say we've come away from that some time ago. Our colleagues in Learning and Development put a lot of work into this to make sure it really was very rounded, with both the voice of the child and the voice of academic experts, and those with lived experience in the room, and making sure officers and staff get the best insight.
Okay, thank you. And is this a common training pattern which is used by police forces across the country, or is it a unique scenario for the Met?
I'm pleased to say I think we've pioneered something very much in terms of the New Met for London training. I know the College of Policing, I'm not speaking for them, were generally quite interested in the product we'd rolled out because it was a 3-day training input, the likes of which I've not seen before. The New Met for London 1 was more values-based and more generic, but New Met for London 2 was 3 days of Soteria training around first responder, child first and adultification training, and then a whole day on domestic abuse, which is its whole other area for a whole other day. But as we all know, comes with myriad challenges, many of which impact on child safeguarding as well. So this really was a meaningful product. Personally supervised almost every area of it myself, helped with the trainer sessions internally and so on. So we've got a really good product there. It is of interest. It's not rolled out nationally yet by any means, and it was a big undertaking for us as a service. Taking 23,000 frontline officers and staff to do this training was testament to how seriously we've taken this. My colleagues in Learning and Development are the experts in this space, but we could certainly provide more detail offline in terms of how we systemise that across the piece. But the phrase trauma-informed, you'll be relieved to hear, The phrase trauma informed, you'll be relieved to hear, is a well-trodden phrase now in police and partner parlance. It's something we're all very alive to as being important in what we do.
Thank you. And obviously one doesn't want to have frontline police officers tied up on training courses all the time, but how frequently is the training refreshed, or are people invited back in for...
There's a very dynamic training programme in place now. So New Met for London 2, as it was rolled out to everyone in service at that time who had a frontline role. But then it's been baked in upstream, the essence of that, into recruit level entry training to make sure that we don't have to constantly repaint the Forth Bridge. So once we've trained everybody in service, then get it into recruit training up front so that we make sure that we've got that baked in at the top. Training is constantly refreshed and reviewed. So I dare say we'll see a slightly different product next time, but hopefully an equally creative and innovative one, because we don't just want to repeat the same training to people over and over again. The idea is we train once, train well, and I think move into a different area as well. So it's an exciting area, but probably one we won't have time to get into in too much detail here today. We can provide more detail offline if helpful.
That would be helpful, thank you, yes. And a follow-up question for the Deputy Mayor. How familiar are you personally with the training which is offered? Have you attended the training sessions?
Myself and MOPAC are involved at every stage of the training journey. So we've been involved in the development of the content, working with colleagues from our Child First team in that. The review of the training, we sit, as I've previously mentioned, on the board for the delivery of the wider, sorry, I've forgotten the word, the Child First strategy, as well as us offering our data and insight team to make sure that the Met, if they want to, have the capability to do that. Actually, one of the things mentioned earlier on dip sampling might be another area on the back of the stop and search work we've done that we can also use our data and insight team to support. So we're very keen to make sure, as I previously mentioned as well, Kevin has previously, and I don't know if he will again, but come to the London Policing Board so that we can track the oversight in that way as well through the London Policing Board on their progress in these areas.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Do you know, it's like a red rag to a bull, keep mentioning the London Policing Board. We're all sick to death of the London Policing Board because it keeps our police officers away from these committees. We're very grateful to have you here today, Kevin, but very often we don't have them. But we do have our Deputy Mayor who comes all the time, for which we're very grateful. But the London Policing Board, I wish you wouldn't mention the damn thing. I tell you, it makes my blood boil every time. Assembly Member Ahmed, very briefly.
Thank you, Chair. DAC Southwood, just with training, you said quite rightly, I think, about, police officers doing PowerPoint training. It just doesn't really work anymore. A couple of years ago, I was lucky enough to join in with the training for stop and search. And one of the things that I felt was missing was the perspective of somebody who was a young person being stopped and searched in the middle of the street and what it felt like for them. With the training that you've described, obviously, we do not want victims to relive their trauma through doing police training, but do you have experts, organisations, anybody other than police officers, and with the greatest respect to your officers, but sometimes it is better to have a different perspective. In that training, is there room for that, and does that happen?
It does indeed. I'm suddenly very aware that I feel like I may have condemned any fellow colleagues who've ever been involved in training. I've been trained many times, over the years, by worthy colleagues doing a good job in that space. So it isn't uniquely the case that officers can't train, and of course they do. And in fact, in our specialised areas, take things like firearms training and things like that, of course, it will be police-led because you need necessary practitioners with the experience to do it. But to your point there, of course, yes, the voice of the child, for instance, in stop and search is routinely brought into our training and awareness packages, which my colleague AC Adelican leads on within Met Operations. Again, I won't pretend to be the force lead for stop and search, but the training around that has for some years now tried to incorporate the voice of children who've got that lived experience of being stopped. And even on our independent advisory groups, I think back to my days with the Trident Independent Advisory Group, one of my most valued members there was one of the leading members of the community who would tell me how many times he'd been stopped and searched and how it felt and what the reaction of the officers was. And as you rightly say, it's only when you stand with someone and discuss it with them that nature, especially as a warrant car carrying police officer myself who's done stops and search over the years, suddenly realise the impact of it. I should say Stop and Search, of course, just for the record, has a really important part in what we do to make sure we safeguard Londoners from knife crime and gun crime and other types of criminality. So, again, but a double-edged thing in that it needs to be done right, needs to be done respectfully, needs to be done professionally, so that those impacted, especially where nothing's found, walk away from their experience, hopefully not resenting too much the fact that we have stopped them and understanding the reasons and the rationale why. But that only comes, as you say, with that lived experience brought into our training, so we manage the encounter correctly.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair.
Well, Assembly Member Ahmed has asked more or less my question, but do you collect feedback from the victims about their interactions with officers?
We do, yes. In terms of, we're not talking about Stop and Search here when we talk about
No, we're absolutely.
victims.
We're going to grooming gangs, which is what we should be talking about all the time.
Yes, we have numerous different sort of victims' voice forums, and then specific ones for things like domestic abuse feedback. We have a sexual violence forum, so we'll collate that from victims directly, and also, to Assemblymember Best's point, through third parties as well, through charities and other institutions who can relay on behalf of those affected what the experience of the people they represent was. So we try to get the voice of the victim or child or the domestic abuse sufferer into all that we do, so we can incorporate that, something we're far more reflective about than I think we were in years gone by.
And how do you sort of incorporate that poor practice if you get feedback on that? How do you reflect that back when you're retraining, or how do you deal with that particular officer?
Yes, well, there have been instances that the panel will be aware where we've had feedback that's indicated a professional standards issue, and that goes straight to our DPS, our Director of Professional Standards, for a misconduct investigation if necessary, where someone's flagged something which is an experience that indicates misconduct. Thankfully, those are fewer and further between, where we just get genuine feedback on something that's not misconduct related but pertains to how we deliver our service. That gets recycled into the training through learning and development, and we make sure that we incorporate that so that all of our colleagues get the messaging around it. So if it is, for instance, that child has been stopped multiple times and then responds in a sort of negative way to officers effecting Stop and Search, it's about understanding, isn't it? This is not their first time, and of course we need to cater for that in how we approach them in that child first way. So hopefully the cycle that you've heard today and our training always reincorporates our learning as we go, and this, contrary to popular belief, we do strive to be a learning organisation that develops as we go, and we're better at that than we ever were before, I think, now.
Yeah, and you're up against massive problems with resource. I do understand that. But we really do have to do something about reputation, because when you speak to victims of years ago, and of course because the boyfriend model, it is years ago that a lot of this happened, their attitude and opinion of the police is so low, and that won't go away in 5 minutes. It will take a long while. So I do hope if any victim survivors are watching today, that if they won't go straight to the police, they do find somebody else that they can go to. I know lots have come to me, that we can try and get information back through to you that way.
Please do.
Yes. Right, we have come, I'm afraid, we've come to the end of this session. I would like to thank our guests for attending today, for today's meeting and for their answers to our questions. Can I ask the committee to note the report and discussion, and can we also delegate authority to me as in chairman with party group lead members to agree any output arising from the decision? Thank you. So unfortunately, we don't have time to hold our monthly question and answer session with the Mayor's Office for Policing and Crime. And I do apologise for that, Deputy Mayor and Will. I know, Deputy Mayor, you and I will never agree on whether I think you're answering the questions properly, but I will say, of all the Deputy Mayors, you always come, you always present here, and for that we are very grateful. I'd be very grateful if you never mentioned the London Policing Board again, but having said that, we are grateful that you do turn up, because a lot of the mayors don't want to do that. And Kevin, thank you so much, because we get far more out of our meetings when we actually have the Metropolitan Police here as well. And sometimes you can answer the questions that are left hanging, which doesn't do the police any good either. So thank you for that. The next question and answer session will take place at the committee's meeting on the 23rd of September. Can I ask the committee to note the report and question and answer sessions with MOPAC? Can I also ask the committee to note the monthly report from MOPAC? Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note its work programme? The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place. I think I've said this. I've got lots of notes here. 9 o'clock on the Oh, no. 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 You see, it's the mention of the London Policing Board. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled to take place on the 9th of September 2026 at 10 a.m. in the Chamber City Hall. I have no urgent business, so that concludes today's meeting.
Chair, no